I have always believed that football, more than any other sport, is a game of shadows. On the surface, it is violent, loud, and spectacular, but beneath that surface lies something far quieter, more hidden, and infinitely more important. Every touchdown you have ever cheered for, every defensive stand that seemed unbreakable, every upset that stunned the nation, none of it happened by accident. Behind the helmets, beyond the stadium lights, there is a language few will ever hear and a code few will ever see. That code lives in the playbook. To most fans, a playbook is just a binder full of diagrams. Arrows pointing this way, circles colliding with X's, some coded names scattered across the page. But that is only the surface. For decades, NFL playbooks have been shrouded in secrecy, guarded like classified files handed out to players with an unspoken rule. Lose this, and you jeopardize everything. A single playbook in the wrong hands can shift a season, alter a career, or expose an empire. The stories surrounding these secret documents are not folklore, they are real. Coaches have burned old playbooks rather than risk a rival studying them. Players have been cut from rosters not because of their performance, but because they could not keep up with the relentless demand to memorize every line of coded instruction. Some playbooks have contained phantom pages plays, drawn up not to be run, but to mislead, confuse, and test loyalty. There have been accusations of espionage, whispered claims that certain teams had somehow obtained the holy grail of another team's strategy. And then there are the urban legends, the ones whispered by veterans long after they've retired, about playbooks designed not only to win games, but to break opponents' spirits. As I reflect on it now, what fascinates me most is not just the content of these playbooks, but the culture of paranoia and secrecy surrounding them. Football is, after all, a game that thrives on deception. A quarterback looks one way, but throws another. A receiver runs a route meant only to pull a safety off balance. A defense disguises its coverage until the very last second. But these small deceptions are fragments of a larger philosophy. In the NFL, information itself is the ultimate weapon, and nowhere is that more concentrated than inside the pages of a team's playbook. The earliest coaches understood this better than anyone. At the dawn of football's professional era, men like Pop Warner were already crafting trick plays and misdirections so bold that newspapers treated them like magic acts. Warner's playbooks were not just instructions, they were weapons designed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outsmart opponents who were often bigger and stronger. In that sense, the playbook has always been football's great equalizer, giving brains the ability to conquer brawn. Decades later, Vince Lombardi would reduce that complexity into something almost biblical. His Packers power sweep was not just a play, it was an identity, drilled into his players until it was second nature. His playbook was slim compared to modern volumes, but its pages were treated like scripture. Opponents knew what was coming and still could not stop it. That was the paradox of Lombardi's secret. The simplicity of the pages masked the complexity of the execution. As the league expanded, so too did the playbooks. Bill Walsh, the architect of the West Coast offense, turned them into encyclopedias. His diagrams were not just lines, but symphonies, where timing and precision mattered more than raw force. Players who saw those playbooks for the first time described the feeling as overwhelming, like being handed a foreign language textbook and told to master it overnight. Yet those who did master it found themselves part of one of football's greatest dynasties, armed with secrets that opponents could never quite solve. But alongside innovation came suspicion. By the turn of the millennium, playbooks were no longer just about what was inside them. They became about who might try to steal them. In 2007, the Spygate scandal exposed just how far teams might go in pursuit of information. The New England Patriots were caught videotaping opposing coaches' signals, igniting debates that still rage today about whether their success was built on unfair access to secrets. It was a reminder that in the NFL, the thin line between genius and espionage often runs straight through the playbook. The secrecy only deepened as technology entered the game. Paper binders were replaced with tablets, and players were warned to guard them with their lives. Teams installed security features to remotely erase playbooks if devices were lost or stolen. One misplaced iPad on an airplane could spark a panic inside a front office, and it has happened more than once. In this digital era, a playbook is no longer just paper as data, and data can be hacked. Yet for all the evolution, some things remain unchanged. Players still speak of sleepless nights, memorizing assignments, of veterans testing rookies on terminology, of coaches quizzing them with the intensity of military officers preparing soldiers for battle. Some describe it as thrilling, others as suffocating, but all agree that the playbook is the lifeblood of the game. Without it, even the most gifted athlete is just another body on the field. With it, that same athlete becomes part of a living, breathing machine. There is also a more human side to these secret pages. Playbooks are not just X's and O's, they are fragments of memory, symbols of the countless hours spent chasing perfection. Some retired players keep their old playbooks as if they were yearbooks, mementos of the time when they lived inside a world of secrets. Others speak of nightmares where they wake up still trying to remember a play call, still running through assignments in their heads long after their careers have ended. And then there are the legends we may never fully know. Stories of decoy binders left out for prying eyes, of coaches who deliberately slipped false pages into circulation to throw rivals off the scent. Stories of plays drawn up in practice that were never run but kept in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment. Stories of playbooks that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside a chosen few. These stories may blur the line between fact and myth, but in the world of football, myth has a way of shaping reality. So as we begin this journey into the hidden world of NFL playbooks, I ask a simple question. How much of the game have we really seen? The touchdowns, the interceptions, the sacks, those are only the visible parts. But the invisible parts, the ones buried inside those binders, tell a far more complex story. They reveal a culture obsessed with secrecy, a sport built as much on misdirection as on muscle, and a league that has always understood that information is the most valuable currency of all. This is not just about football. It is about strategy, about human nature, about the lengths people will go to guard what they know and to uncover what they do not. It is about a game played not just on the field, but in the shadows of meeting rooms and film sessions, in whispered codes and locked binders. It is about the power of knowledge and the fear of losing it. And that is why the story of the NFL's secret playbooks matters. Because once you understand what is inside them, you realize that the game you thought you knew has always been hiding something more, something deeper, something it never wanted to share. When I think about football, I think about layers. The surface layer is the one we all see. The stadiums, the broadcasts, the spectacle of a sport that has become America's most popular entertainment. That layer is intoxicating, full of drama, tension, and instant gratification. But peel back the surface, and a second layer appears, one that only players and coaches are allowed to touch. That layer is the playbook. And inside those pages lies the truth of the game, the real heartbeat of the NFL. The playbook is where football's mythology collides with its reality. It is not just a set of instructions. It is the DNA of a team. Each diagram, each coded phrase, each formation represents choices made after hours of film study, after sleepless nights of planning, after debates among coaches who know their jobs and sometimes their legacies depend on what is written there. It is not exaggeration to say that playbooks are the most valuable documents in professional sports. To understand their significance, you have to understand what they represent historically. In the earliest days of football, there was no such thing as a formal playbook. Teams lined up, ran the ball, and improvised. But as the sport evolved, as strategy became just as important as strength, the need for written instructions emerged. College coaches like Amos Alonzo Stagg and Pop Warner began sketching plays that redefined the game. Warner's famed single and double wing formations were so radical that newspapers wrote about them as if they were sorcery. His diagrams, carefully preserved, were some of the first true playbooks, artifacts of a sport that was becoming less about brute force and more about intellectual dominance. By the time professional football began to take root, the playbook was indispensable. Every team had one, but no two were alike. Some were thin, emphasizing execution over variety. Others were dense, filled with experimental plays that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. In the early NFL, players carried their playbooks like soldiers carrying orders. Losing one was unthinkable, not just because it betrayed a team's trust, but because it could hand opponents a tactical advantage they should never possess. The secrecy grew naturally out of necessity. Football is not chess, it's a collision of massive bodies in real time. But like chess, it thrives on anticipation and foresight. Who knows what play is coming holds the most dangerous advantage imaginable. That reality turned playbooks into something sacred, something guarded with almost paranoid vigilance. Stories from as early as the 1940s tell of coaches finding players for leaving playbooks unattended in hotel rooms. There were even instances where discarded pages were burned rather than thrown away, just to ensure they could not fall into enemy hands. But it wasn't just about protection, it was also about power. The playbook became a symbol of authority, a coach's way of asserting control over the chaos of the game. Vince Lombardi is remembered for his speeches, his aura, his iron will. Yet those who played for him will tell you that his playbook was his truest instrument of discipline. Lombardi's Green Bay Packers executed the famed power sweep so perfectly because his playbook drilled it into them relentlessly. He didn't need 1,000 plays, he needed a handful, repeated until they were etched into muscle memory. His players learned that the power sweep was more than a play, it was the embodiment of their identity as a team. As the decades advanced, playbooks became mirrors of the game's evolution. In the 1980s, Bill Walsh's West Coast offense reshaped football by prioritizing short, precise passing over brute force rushing. His playbooks swelled with diagrams that looked more like architectural blueprints than sports instructions. Quarterbacks were required not just to throw accurately, but to read defenses like field generals adjusting routes on the fly. Walsh's players described the system as overwhelming at first, but once mastered, it turned ordinary offenses into juggernauts. The San Francisco 49ers dynasty was not just a triumph of talent, it was the manifestation of pages written in a playbook so intricate that rivals spent years trying to decode it. That culture of secrecy only deepened in the modern era. The NFL is not just competitive, it is cutthroat. The margin between victory and defeat can be a single mistake, a single play. Playbooks are often hundreds, even thousands of pages, filled with details about every possible scenario. Some teams go so far as to print different editions for different position groups, ensuring that no single binder contains the full picture. Players have spoken about how daunting it is, describing playbooks as novels they are expected to memorize overnight. It's like learning a new language every season. One former quarterback once said, "With that much information comes risk." Losing a playbook is not like losing a textbook, it is like losing classified intelligence. And the NFL has seen its share of scandals. The Patriots Spygate in 2007 revealed how far one team would go to capture the signals and strategies of another. While the scandal centered on videotaping signals, the implication was clear. If you could decode a rival's playbook, you could control the game before it even started. Teams doubled down on secrecy after that, introducing coded terminology that could change week to week, ensuring that even if someone thought they knew what was coming, they could never be certain. Technology amplified the paranoia. Tablets replaced paper, but digital convenience brought new dangers. Stories circulated of players leaving team-issued devices behind on flights or in restaurants, sparking frantic efforts to recover or remotely wipe the data. Some teams even embedded hidden tracking or auto-delete functions. treating their playbooks with the same level of protection a government might use for sensitive intelligence. The idea that a rival might hack into one of these devices no longer felt like a far-fetched thriller. It felt like a legitimate concern. But what makes this story more than just one of secrecy and strategy is the human element. Players describe sleepless nights in training camp, poring over diagrams, memorizing formations, terrified of being caught unprepared in practice. For rookies, the playbook often feels like a tidal wave. Veterans talk about the anxiety of being tested by coaches in meetings, asked to recite assignments under pressure. Some players excel in that environment, their minds wired to absorb detail and process it at speed. Others drown, cut not for lack of talent, but for lack of mastery of the pages in front of them. The playbook, in this sense, is not just a guide, it is a gatekeeper. There are also the myths, the stories that have floated around the league for years. Some insist that teams have inserted phantom pages into Playbooks' decoy plays never intended to be run, designed only to expose leaks. Others whisper about legendary trick plays drawn up decades ago and locked away, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Whether true or not, the existence of such myths underscores the aura surrounding these documents. They are not just binders. They are treasures, legends, weapons, and sometimes traps. So why does all of this matter? Because playbooks reveal a side of football that fans rarely think about. We see the end result, the 3 hours on Sunday, but we do not see the countless hours of preparation. The psychological battles waged in classrooms and meeting rooms, the paranoia that seeps into every corner of the sport. Playbooks are where the game truly begins. They are where creativity collides with discipline, where innovation is born, where dynasties are built. They are also where fear lives, the fear of losing an edge, the fear of being outsmarted, the fear of secrets slipping into enemy hands. This documentary will take us deep into that world. We will explore the origins of the playbook, tracing its roots back to the earliest days of football. We will revisit the moments when playbooks became legendary, from Lombardi's simplicity to Walsh's complexity. We will examine the scandals that revealed just how far teams would go to protect or steal information. We will hear from the players who lived through the pressure of mastering these encyclopedias of strategy, and we will uncover the myths and legends that still haunt locker rooms. By the end of this journey, my hope is simple: to show that the NFL's greatest drama has never been only on the field. It has also been in the pages of documents the public was never meant to see, in the whispered codes that shaped games long before kickoff. These are the stories of the NFL's secret playbooks, the tactics they never shared, and the hidden truths of a sport built on deception as much as on strength. I've always believed the origins of football's most sacred texts were never written in stadiums filled with cheering fans. They were born in dimly lit locker rooms, on chalkboards smudged with dusty white streaks, and in the minds of men who saw the game as both a science and a weapon. To understand the secret playbooks, you have to go back not to the bright lights of the Super Bowl, but to the muddy fields of the early 20th century, where strategy was survival, and survival was secrecy. Back then, football wasn't polished. It was brutal, chaotic, and at times lawless. The game was still finding itself. Helmets were little more than leather caps. Rules were constantly shifting, and injuries were a grim certainty. In that world, victory didn't always belong to the strongest. Sometimes it belonged to the clever. Coaches like Pop Warner understood this better than anyone. He saw the game less as a brawl and more as a puzzle one that could be solved with geometry, deception, and discipline. His single-wing formation was revolutionary, a precursor to modern offensive creativity. The way he aligned his players, the way he used motion and fakes, it was theater disguised as sport. Warner wasn't just teaching football, he was writing scripture. Knute Rockne followed with his Notre Dame system, sharpening the art of timing, precision, and passing routes when most teams were still grinding the ball on the ground. The forward pass itself, legalized in 1906, was considered scandalous, almost an affront to tradition. But Rockne weaponized it. He coached with a playbook that looked more like a mathematician's notebook than a game plan. "There is no substitute for thorough preparation," Rockne famously said. And his preparation was etched in plays designed to fool defenses who had never seen such patterns before. It's easy to forget, in the age of digital tablets and instant replay, just how secretive these early scripts were. They weren't just instructions, they were guarded like wartime codes. A rival coach who stumbled upon them would have an almost unfair advantage. Even the players themselves often weren't allowed to keep copies. They memorized, rehearsed, repeated until every assignment was instinct, not just ink on paper. That paranoia had roots. In the 1920s and 1930s, as football grew into a national fascination, accusations of playbook theft became whispers around the league. Players traded between teams sometimes carried more than their talent. They carried fragments of schemes, terminology, tendencies. Coaches began developing code words, false signals, and decoy plays just to protect themselves. The playbook, even then, was less about what was written and more about what was hidden. I think about Paul Brown, often credited as one of the greatest innovators in football history. In the 1940s and 50s, Brown didn't just modernize the game, he systematized it. He created the first detailed playbooks, complete with diagrams, terminology, and structured practice routines. His players on the Cleveland Browns weren't just athletes, they were students. Brown issued binders that read like military field manuals. Every route had a number. Every responsibility was mapped. He invented the taxi squad, essentially a reserve unit. He introduced film study, making the game as much about intelligence as instinct. And here's where the secrecy deepened. Brown's playbooks weren't just guarded, they were institutionalized. Players were expected to turn them back in at the end of the season. Losing one wasn't an option. The fear wasn't just that a rival team might learn a few plays. It was that they might gain insight into the entire philosophy of how Brown's team functioned. That was the kind of edge that couldn't be undone. As the decades passed, the playbook evolved alongside the league. Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers in the 1960s became famous for the Packers sweep. A simple-looking play, but behind it was a mountain of preparation, repetition, and execution. Lombardi drilled it so often, so ruthlessly, that opponents knew it was coming and still couldn't stop it. His playbook, though relatively thin compared to today's encyclopedias, was precise. Every block, every step, every angle mattered. The secrecy wasn't about overwhelming complexity. It was about protecting the razor's edge of perfection. What fascinates me is how, through all of this, the culture of secrecy around playbooks mirrored something far larger. Football was America's version of a chess match played at full speed, under the roar of tens of thousands. And like chess masters, coaches guarded their openings, their gambits, their counters. Every new wrinkle added to a playbook was a move designed, not only to advance their strategy, but to conceal it until the perfect moment. There were scandals, too. By the 1970s and 80s, rumors swirled of teams acquiring opponents' playbooks through questionable means. A player cut from one roster and signed by another could suddenly recall formations and tendencies. Coaches began running dummy plays in practice just to throw off spies. Bill Walsh, the architect of the West Coast offense, went so far as to design plays that looked identical for the first few seconds, only to diverge at the last possible moment. Deception became art, and the playbook became its canvas. I remember reading a quote from former quarterback Steve Young, who said, "The playbook was so thick, it felt like I was carrying the weight of the game itself." That was an exaggeration. By the late 20th century, playbooks had grown to hundreds of pages. Terminology expanded into a language only insiders could understand. A single play call could be a sentence long, encoding formation, motion, protection, route combinations, and adjustments. Players weren't just running plays anymore, they were decoding encrypted instructions in real time. But no matter how thick they became, the true secrets were never written on the page. They were in the wrinkles coaches didn't show, the adjustments they whispered on the sidelines, the audibles called at the line of scrimmage. Those moments were never handed out in binders. They were passed down orally, practiced in shadows, executed under the weight of silence. Looking back, the origins of the playbook feel almost mythic. From chalkboards to binders to digital tablets, the constant thread has been secrecy. Every coach believed, deep down, that what they held in their hands was more than a stack of diagrams. It was their legacy, their identity, their competitive soul. The history of the NFL is written not just in games played, but in the hidden pages that never made it to the public eye. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all. For a sport played in front of millions, so much of its genius has always lived in the shadows, guarded, whispered, concealed. The playbook has never just been about football. It has been about trust, deception, and the eternal war between what is revealed and what is withheld. This is where the journey begins. That's the roots of the playbook. In a time when every secret mattered and every secret shaped the future of the game. From these early formations and philosophies grew the labyrinth of tactics we see today, many of them still carrying the fingerprints of Warner, Rockne, Brown, Lombardi, and Walsh. The Playbook's origins are not just history, they are the foundation of the NFL's most guarded mysteries. I have always believed that football is not just a sport, it is a mirror. It reflects the times, the fears, and the ambitions of the nation that created it. And if you look closely at the history of the NFL, you find that some of its most radical innovations, its most secretive playbooks did not emerge in isolation. They were born in the shadow of geopolitics, in the paranoia of the Cold War, when America feared the unseen, the unknown, and the unpredictable. And on the gridiron, that paranoia turned into creativity. When we think of the Cold War, we think of nuclear weapons, spy planes, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. But on football fields across the country, coaches began to treat the game as a miniature battlefield, a place where deception, misdirection, and hidden signals could change everything. They weren't just designing plays, they were designing counterintelligence operations. By the 1950s, as the United States squared off against the Soviet Union, football became a theater of strategy. Paul Brown, the legendary coach of the Cleveland Browns, pioneered methods that seemed almost militaristic. He created a detailed playbook system, numbering plays like a commander issuing orders. Each player had precise, regimented responsibilities. In his mind, the field was a map, the players were units, and every yard gained was territory captured. But there was something else. Brown did not simply create plays, he created codes. System of hand signals, wristbands, and even play cards carried echoes of wartime code breaking. "We were out there running an army," one of his former players once said. Every move had to be timed, every word had to be precise. The Cold War influenced how coaches thought about information. Misinformation became as valuable as execution. The playbook was no longer just about gaining yards, it was about controlling what the other side could not see. Just as the CIA built layers of secrecy, football coaches began hiding intentions within layered formations. A run might look like a pass might disguise itself as a run, and the defense could never be sure until it was too late. The 1960s brought an escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the world holding its breath, and in football, the stakes felt just as high, if only symbolically. Coaches like Vince Lombardi of the Green Bay Packers believed that order, discipline, and secrecy were non-negotiable. His playbooks were guarded like state documents. Some players remembered being told never to let their notebooks leave the locker room. "If you lose this book," Lombardi reportedly warned, "you're not just costing us a game, you're giving the enemy an advantage." It was in this climate that football embraced espionage-like tactics. Teams hired scouts not only to evaluate talent, but also to gather intelligence on opponents, signals, formations, and habits. Entire staffs were dedicated to decoding the opposition, much like military analysts poring over intercepted communications. And sometimes, just like in real espionage, the line between observation and outright theft blurred. One of the most famous examples came decades later, when the New England Patriots were caught in the Spygate scandal, accused of illegally videotaping opponents' signals. But the roots of such behavior were planted much earlier. Coaches in the Cold War era normalized the idea that intelligence, gathering sometimes by any means necessary, was as important as execution on the field. The influence of Cold War secrecy also birthed deception at a creative level. Tom Landry, head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, epitomized this mindset. A former military officer, Landry approached football with a calm, calculating demeanor. He introduced the flex defense, a system that baffled offenses by disguising alignments and forcing quarterbacks to misread coverages. To opponents, it felt like trying to decode encrypted signals in real time. Players themselves began to feel like operatives. Wide receivers practiced hand gestures to quietly communicate audibles. Quarterbacks used coded cadences to manipulate defensive reactions. And offensive linemen, those silent giants, sometimes shifted their stances in micro-movements that carried secret messages about the coming play. It was a language hidden in plain sight. I think often about how much of this mirrored the culture of the era. In the 1960s and 70s, American citizens lived with a constant awareness of nuclear war. Families were told to keep bomb shelters. Children rehearsed, hiding under school desks in case of an attack. In that same atmosphere, football became a sport, obsessed with hiding, disguising, and surviving. Every play was a chess match, a duel of wits, and every coach carried the burden of secrecy. But here, as the truth few outside the game understood. Not all secrets were about trick plays or innovative schemes. Some were about protecting vulnerabilities. In the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union tried to hide their weaknesses as much as their strengths. Football coaches, too, kept certain truths locked away. Injuries were masked, players pushed through pain, and medical reports were often vague or misleading. A star quarterback might be struggling with broken ribs, but the public and, most importantly, the opponent could never know. In that sense, secrecy wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival. And then came the playbook innovations that looked almost alien. The wishbone offense, born at the University of Texas in 1968, was so unconventional that many defenders compared it to facing an enemy they had never seen before. 3 running backs in the backfield created endless possibilities. Who would take the ball? Where would it go? And when would the defense know? To some, it felt like a battlefield feint, a ruse designed to overwhelm with uncertainty. And in truth, that was exactly what it was. By the 1970s, football strategy had fully internalized the Cold War mentality: concealment, deception, and psychological warfare. Bill Walsh, who would later revolutionize the game with his West Coast offense, often said that success was about controlling the opponent's expectations. Make them believe they know what's coming, Walsh explained, then hit them with something entirely different. It sounded less like a football philosophy and more like the doctrine of a spy agency. This was the essence of the secret playbook, not just the collection of plays, but the philosophy of misleading your opponent, making them second guess and breaking their confidence before you broke their defense. I have always thought that this was football-esque Cold War legacy, the belief that the mind could be weaponized as effectively as the body. The irony is that most fans never saw the full depth of it. Television broadcasts showed the touchdowns, the highlight runs, the bone-crushing tackles. But hidden in the margins between the huddles and the timeouts was a war of signals, codes, and disguises. Unless you were in the locker room, unless you held that sacred binder of plays and counterplays, you could never know how much of the game was fought in silence. And yet, the Cold War of strategy left scars. Just as nations became addicted to secrecy, teams sometimes fell victim to their own paranoia. Coaches overcomplicated playbooks, filling them with so many variations and disguises that players struggled to keep up. miscommunication became its own form of sabotage. Some locker rooms fractured under the pressure. Veterans accused rookies of leaking information or not keeping up with coded systems. But when it worked, when deception succeeded, the results were unforgettable. Trick plays like the flea flicker or the hook and ladder thrived in this environment of secrecy. Entire Super Bowls were decided by plays that existed outside the conventional playbook. Plays whispered in practice, saved for the right moment, and executed with precision when the world least expected it. The Cold War ended in 1991, but its imprint on football never disappeared. Coaches today still guard their playbooks with the same intensity as classified documents. Players still memorize coded language, still adjust signals week to week in case opponents have deciphered them. And the obsession with misdirection remains alive, a living artifact of a time when America feared an invisible enemy and, on the field, created invisible plans to win. I sometimes wonder if the playbook itself, those binders, those coded systems will one day be studied not just as sports artifacts, but as cultural relics, because they tell a story that is bigger than football. They tell us about who we were in the Cold War, secretive, cautious, obsessed with strategy, and willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect an advantage. And so, when people ask me why the NFL's secret playbooks matter, I tell them this: they are not just about touchdowns and championships. They are about history. They are about a country that once believed the smallest detail, the smallest secret, could tip the balance of power. And on the field, just like in the world, those secrets often made the difference between survival and defeat. This was the Cold War of strategy, the hidden war that shaped the modern game. I've always believed that football, more than any other sport, is a contest of truth and lies. On the surface, it looks simple: one team runs a play, the other tries to stop it. But peel back the layers, and you realize that deception is as vital to the NFL as brute force. Every snap is a performance in controlled misdirection, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the hidden corners of the playbook. By the 1970s, as television turned the NFL into a weekly national ritual, teams began to realize something sobering. The game was being studied, not just by opponents, but by millions of fans, reporters, and even amateur scouts with VCRs. Every move could be rewound, dissected, and analyzed frame by frame. Coaches knew they had to get smarter, subtler, and above all more deceptive. And so began what I call the shadows in the playbook. The carefully scripted misdirections, feints, and disguises designed not just to move the ball, but to control perception itself. Take the classic example of the reverse. At its core, it's simple. A handoff goes one way, then gets flipped back the other. But what looks like a trick is actually an entire philosophy in motion. It plays on human instinct, the defender's drive to pursue the ball immediately. Coaches discovered that by building entire formations around false cues motions, fakes, decoys, they could not just outmuscle defenses, but outthink them. Vince Lombardi once said, "Football is two things. It's blocking and tackling." I don't care about formations or trick plays, yet even in Lombardi's rigid worldview, deception found its way in. Green Bay's famous sweep was as much about making defenders believe the play was headed elsewhere as it was about execution. As years passed, playbooks began to reflect this duality: the honest play versus the deceptive play. Coaches scribbled down not just X's and O's, but illusions. They began inserting entire sequences of plays designed to look identical but unfold in completely different directions. It was chess cloaked as warfare, and the NFL became addicted to it. Bill Walsh took this idea to its intellectual peak. The so-called West Coast offense wasn't just a short passing system. It was a masterclass in deception. Every quick slant, every out route, every play-action fake was meant to force defenders into a guessing game they could never win. Walsh once explained it in terms of psychology. You want them thinking they've seen this before, when really, they haven't. In practice, that meant building playbooks with layers. the same formation could produce a dozen different outcomes. To the defense, it was a puzzle with no key. To Walsh, it was theater. But deception wasn't always artistic, it was often brutal. The cutback run, for instance, preyed on over-pursuit, using defenders' aggression against them. Quarterbacks learned to look off safeties, training their eyes in one direction before hurling the ball somewhere else entirely. Entire special teams units were devoted to fake punts, fake field goals, fake kneels. Every page of the playbook carried the fingerprints of misdirection because coaches knew the truth. In the NFL, if you're predictable, you're dead. Yet what fascinates me most is how secrecy intertwined with this culture of deception. Teams began to treat playbooks like classified documents. Coaches handed out multiple versions to players, each coded and watermarked. So if one went missing, they'd know who leaked it. Stories circulated of rival teams hiring spies to watch practices from tall buildings. There were even accusations, some credible, that teams tried to steal discarded playbooks from hotel trash bins before big games. It became espionage, disguised as sport. The paranoia was justified. In 2007, the infamous Spygate scandal confirmed what many suspected. The New England Patriots had been filming opponents' signals from unauthorized locations, compiling a library of stolen knowledge. To some, it was cheating. To others, it was simply the modern extension of football's oldest truth: win by any means necessary. What mattered was not just having a playbook, but guarding it as if it were nuclear codes. This raises a deeper question. Where is the line between creativity and subterfuge? Coaches like Walsh saw deception as artistry, a way to elevate the game. Others weaponized it, turning playbooks into catalogs of tricks meant to blur the edge of legality. The truth lies somewhere in between. Deception became not just a tactic, but a culture. It seeped into how players practiced, how they watched film, even how they spoke to reporters. In football, telling the truth was never the point hiding it was. One of the more chilling stories I came across involved a defensive coordinator in the 1980s who deliberately planted false plays in a forgotten notebook, knowing rival scouts might find it. When the opponent adjusted its defense based on the fake information, his team exploited the opening for a crucial win. Nothing about it broke the rules. Everything about it captured the reality of NFL strategy. The game is as much about what you don't reveal as what you do. Players lived within this culture of illusion. Wide receivers were taught to sell every route with identical body language, whether it was a bomb downfield or a quick curl. Running backs carried out fakes with the same intensity as real runs, because one convincing fake could buy the quarterback 2 extra seconds of life. Even quarterbacks, the supposed truth tellers of the huddle, became actors using cadence, tone, and body motion to disguise intentions until the very last instant. And the fans, they were part of the illusion too. To the untrained eye, a reverse or a flea flicker looked like magic. But behind that magic was years of refinement, hundreds of hours of drilling, and the understanding that the NFL thrives on secrets. The playbook wasn't just a guide to winning games. It was a ledger of lies. What makes this shadow world so compelling is the paradox at its heart. Football is celebrated as the ultimate test of toughness and honesty. Line up, man against man, and see who's stronger. Yet the playbook reveals the opposite. Winning often depends on who can tell the better lie. It's a contradiction that defines the NFL, and it's why the culture of deception has endured. Every innovation, from the spread offense to the wildcat, has carried within it a sleight of hand. Every dynasty, from Lombardi's Packers to Belichick's Patriots, has thrived not just on execution, but on the ability to manipulate perception. When I look back, I see a league that learned long ago how to weaponize shadows. The playbook became both map and mask, a record of strategies never meant to see the light of day. And maybe that's why, decades later, these secret tactics still capture our imagination. They remind us that beneath the collision of bodies and the roar of crowds lies something quieter, darker, and far more cerebral: the art of deception. And as the NFL entered the modern age, this art would evolve into something even more dangerous: technology-fueled espionage, algorithmic scouting, and a new era where secrecy wasn't just a weapon, but a survival tool. Because in the NFL, secrets don't stay hidden forever, and when they surface, they change the game. Football has always been a game of secrets. For every offensive scheme that promised innovation, there was a defensive mind working in the shadows, pulling apart its seams thread by thread. If the hidden playbooks of the NFL were written in the ink of creativity and deception, then the defensive counter-strategies were written in the ink of suspicion and resistance. To study an opponent's playbook wasn't enough. To dismantle it required something darker, something obsessive. And across the league, a handful of defensive architects dedicated their lives to stripping away the illusion, exposing the core of even the most secret designs. I think about Buddy Ryan first. His '85 Bears defense wasn't just dominant, it was destructive. A force so overwhelming it made entire playbooks obsolete. Ryan looked at offensive innovation not with admiration, but with contempt. To him, every trick, every misdirection, every carefully scripted illusion was nothing more than a puzzle waiting to be broken. His 46 defense wasn't just alignment and pressure. It was a declaration of war. He packed the line with bodies, dared quarterbacks to read through the chaos, and overwhelmed the timing that secret plays relied upon. Misdirection collapsed when linebackers shot gaps before the ball could even be handed off. Trick formations crumbled when the pocket was destroyed before the quarterback could sell his fate. Ryan's philosophy was simple: if you hit them hard enough, long enough, no secret survives. But football is never static. Just as the offense evolves, so does the defense. When I reflect on the history of the league, I see this eternal duel between secrecy and exposure. Playbooks were crafted like treasure maps, hiding designs meant to confuse. But defenses, led by men like Ryan, became cryptographers. They cracked the code, play by play, until the mystery lost its shine. Bill Belichick represents the next great leap. While Ryan relied on brutality, Belichick relied on intellect. His genius was never in brute force, was in dissection. When his Patriots faced the greatest show on turf, Rams in Super Bowl 36, he wasn't just preparing to stop a team. He was preparing to dismantle a philosophy. The Rams thrived on tempo, spacing, and unpredictability. Everything a secret playbook was designed to weaponize. But Belichick and his staff studied tendencies until patterns emerged. They forced receivers inside, jammed timing routes, and disguised coverage to rob Kurt Warner of his quick reads. The Rams' complexity collapsed into hesitation. In that moment, Belichick didn't just beat an opponent. He beat the idea that secrecy could sustain itself without flaw. There's something almost poetic about the way defenses evolve in response to hidden playbooks. Every innovation is met with resistance. Offenses create, defenses destroy. Offenses hide, defenses uncover. It's a cycle as old as the game itself, and each era has its champions. The Steel Curtain in Pittsburgh thrived, not on deception, but on suffocating physicality. The Baltimore Ravens of 2000 weaponized confusion with complex blitzes that made offensive scripts meaningless. Each time, it was as if defenses declared, "We know your secrets, and they won't save you." I've always been fascinated by the psychology behind these defensive minds. Buddy Ryan wasn't just coaching, he was hunting. Belichick wasn't just analyzing, he was calculating, coldly, methodically. To them, the offensive playbook wasn't a sacred text, it was contraband. Something stolen, hidden, guarded, and their job was to expose it to the light, no matter how clever or carefully concealed. What makes this duel even more compelling is the way it shaped legacies. Offensive coaches often became celebrated innovators, the West Coast disciples, the Air Coryell pioneers, the spread gurus. But the defensive architects rarely sought the spotlight. Their legacy was in silence, in the plays that never made the highlight reel, because they had been shut down before they could unfold. Think of Belichick holding Marshall Faulk to irrelevance, or Ryan sending quarterbacks to the turf before they could release the ball. In those moments, the hidden playbooks were not just countered, they were erased. I recall a quote from Bill Parcells, a man who knew the way to preparation. You are what your record says you are. But I'd argue that teams are also what their opponents reveal them to be. A secret only holds power until someone exposes it. Once defenses began reading tendencies with the precision of codebreakers, once they used film like a scalpel to cut apart deception, the illusion of secrecy faded. What mattered wasn't the brilliance of the design, but the resilience of the response. And yet, offenses never stopped trying. Even after Belichick's masterpiece against the Rams, offensive coordinators doubled down on disguised motion, spread, tempo, RPOs, layered reads. The NFL became a chessboard where every move was countered, every trick met with skepticism. What strikes me is how much of this war is invisible to fans. We see the touchdown, the interception, the sack. What we don't see are the nights spent in dark film rooms where a coach rewinds the same snap 50 times to discover the telelineman leaning, a receiver split, a quarterback's eye movement. That's where playbooks, secret or otherwise, live or die. Defenses like Ryan's and Belichick's remind us of a brutal truth. In football, secrecy is temporary. Illusions don't last forever. The more they're studied, the more they're dismantled. Every hidden play is only as strong as its weakest tell, its most fragile assumption. And when a defense finds that crack, the entire design collapses. I think about the 2007 Super Bowl, when Belichick's Giants faced the undefeated Patriots. This time, it wasn't offensive secrets under the microscope, it was Belichick's own dynasty being tested. Steve Spagnuolo's defensive front pressured Tom Brady relentlessly, collapsing the pocket, erasing the timing of the most prolific offense in NFL history. In one night, the supposed invincibility of a record-setting playbook was undone by defensive aggression and discipline. Once again, a hidden philosophy had been dragged into the light and broken. So much of this story, this duel between secret playbooks and defensive counter-strategies, reflects something larger about football itself. It's not just about the plays. It's not just about the plays, about the refusal to let mystery endure. To me, the defensive masterminds were the guardians of reality. They forced defenses to prove that their illusions could withstand scrutiny. And most of the time, they couldn't. When Buddy Ryan designed the 46, when Belichick dissected the Rams, when Spagnuolo broke the Patriots' rhythm, they weren't just creating schemes, they were tearing away masks. They were saying, your secrets don't scare us. And in that relentless exposure, the NFL became what it truly is. Not a game of tricks, but a game of truth revealed through violence and persistence. The hidden playbooks gave us innovation, but the defensive counter-strategies gave us clarity. Without them, the NFL would be a magician's act with no skeptic in the audience. With them, the league became something else, entirely an eternal duel where no secret was safe, no design untouchable, no play immune from exposure. Because in the end, every secret playbook has a counter. And the men who lived to find a try in Belichick, Spagnuolo didn't just change games. They changed the very definition of truth in football. I've even always believed that the real soul of football doesn't live in the ink of a playbook hit, lives in the silence before the snap. That moment when a quarterback stands tall behind his center, eyes scanning, fingers flexing, cadence just about to begin, but everything, absolutely everything, could change with a single word. Audibles, those hidden improvisations. Those last-second adjustments whispered into existence have always been the league's most elusive form of strategy. They're the secret language of survival, the bridge between preparation and instinct. And for decades, they've lived in the shadows of the NFL's so-called secret playbooks. The playbook itself could be memorized, duplicated, even stolen. Defenses, as we've already seen, had their ways of decoding the supposed innovations of coaches. But the Audible, that was different. It was fluid, invisible until executed. A ghost moving through the noise of 60,000 screaming fans. And in those moments, it wasn't just about the play that was called. It was about who had the courage to trust instinct, who could disguise intent, and who could transform chaos into opportunity. Take Peyton Manning, for example, the master conductor of the Audible. To the average viewer, his constant shouts of Omaha. Omaha at the line might have looked like theater, a routine chant. But inside those syllables was layered meaning. A realignment here, a hot route there, a subtle shift in protection. And the genius of it wasn't just the complexity, was the misdirection. Sometimes Omaha meant nothing at all. Sometimes it was bait. The secret wasn't in the word itself, but in the uncertainty it created. But Manning wasn't the first, nor will he be the last. Long before him, quarterbacks like Johnny Unitas pioneered improvisational command at the line. Unitas didn't just run what was drawn on a clipboard. He felt the defense breathing across from him and adjusted accordingly. As one teammate once put it, the play started when Johnny spoke, not when the coach called it in. That philosophy shaped generations. Hidden audibles became an art because they thrived on deception. Coaches would load their quarterbacks with entire dictionaries of dummy calls. 1 week, Texas meant a screen pass. The next, it was nothing but noise, a decoy to bait defenders into revealing coverage. Sometimes, quarterbacks weren't even changing the play, they were changing perception. A cornerback leaning half a step out of position was all it took for a completion downfield. Improvisation, though, stretched even further than spoken words. Players developed hand signals, nods, subtle taps on the thigh pads. Quarterbacks and receivers shared codes no defense could ever fully crack. Joe Montana and Jerry Rice became famous for this silent synchronization. Montana once explained it simply. Sometimes I just had to look at Jerry, and we knew. It was telepathy, forged in repetition, trust, and unspoken genius. To a defense, it looked like chance. To the offense, it was a carefully guarded secret. The danger of audibles and why they fit so perfectly into the mythology of secret. Playbooks is that they weren't always written down. Unlike a West Coast offense diagram or a blitz package, audibles lived in memory, in voice, in shared intuition. That made them both powerful and fragile. A player traded mid-season might carry those verbal codes to a rival locker room. A microphone too close to the line of scrimmage could capture a pattern. Suddenly, what was once a hidden edge became a vulnerability. That's why the NFL's history with audibles is also a history of constant reinvention. Coaches like Bill Walsh and later Sean Payton understood that the audible wasn't just a toolet, was an entire system of adaptation. They crafted offenses flexible enough to bend with whatever their quarterbacks saw on the field. But defenses weren't blind to it. They started planting their own countermeasures. Some linebackers would bark out fake adjustments, hoping to confuse the offense. Safeties disguised coverages, showing one look and morphing into another at the last second. It was a chess match, played not on a board, but in the heartbeat between huddle and snap. The improvisational genius wasn't limited to quarterbacks either. Running backs had their own adjustments. A legendary example was Emmitt Smith, who often altered his path based on the subtle movements of his offensive line. If a defender over-pursued by half a yard, Smith instinctively cut the opposite way in, audible written not in words, but in steps. Wide receivers like Randy Moss thrived on broken plays, turning what looked like disaster into highlight reels. For Moss, improvisation wasn't panic, was opportunity. Daunt Culpepper broke the pocket, I just ran to daylight, he once explained. That daylight was the space no defense could script against. The hidden brilliance of Audibles is that they blurred the line between preparation and chaos. They proved that football wasn't just about who had the thickest playbook or the cleverest coach. It was about trust in instincts, trust in chemistry, trust in the ability to see and react faster than the opponent. It was human intelligence clashing at full speed. But Audibles also carried a darker truth. They exposed who couldn't adapt. Some quarterbacks froze under the pressure of too much freedom. Some receivers missed the signals. And when that happened, the beauty of improvisation collapsed into the ugliness of miscommunication. An interception wasn't just a turnover, it was the price of a broken code. Still, the allure of the hidden audible has never faded. Even in today's NFL, where playbooks have grown into digital libraries and defenses study hours of high-definition film, the audible remains the last true secret on the field. Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Aaron Rodgers, they all keep alive the art of deception at the line. With a flick of the wrist or a muttered cadence, they carry forward the legacy of those who treated the audible not as a backup plan, but as a weapon. And here's the thing, fans rarely know the truth in real time. We hear the shouts, see the shifts, but unless you're inside the huddle, you'll never know what was real and what was smoke. That's the beauty of it. The Audible is a secret playbook hidden inside the secret playbook, always evolving, never fully revealed. I think about it often. The way a single word whispered at the line could tilt the fate of a championship. How a look between quarterback and receiver could mean the difference between defeat and glory. These were the plays that never made it into binders or film rooms. These were the plays that lived only in the moment, in the trust between men, in the improvisation that defined the essence of football. And in that improvisation, we find the heart of the game itself. Because football, for all its structure and strategy, is still played by human beings under impossible pressure. And in the crucible of those moments, the greatest secrets weren't found in the diagrams. They were spoken, gestured, or simply felt. That's why, even now, the audible remains one of the most sacred and untouchable truths in the NFL. When the game crossed into the modern era, secrecy no longer lived just in the ink of spiral-bound playbooks or the whispered signals. A quarterback crouched under center. By the late 20th century, the battle over information had shifted to technology, communication systems, and surveillance. Football was no longer simply about brute force or brilliant improvisation. It was about managing the flow of information with the precision of a military operation. And with that shift came paranoia, innovation, and controversy. The introduction of headset communication in 1994 was meant to solve a basic problem. Before then, quarterbacks relied on relayed hand signals from the sideline, or on sprinting substitutes to deliver the next call. It slowed down tempo, forced predictability, and opened the door for defensive coordinators to steal signals. When the NFL approved helmet headsets, suddenly the quarterback had a direct line to the offensive coordinator, a voice guiding him through the chaos. It was a breakthrough, but also a new battlefield. Bill Belichick, who had cut his teeth as a defensive strategist long before he became the face of New England dominance, understood what this meant better than most. A single channel between coach and quarterback turned the game into a chessboard wired with invisible strings. Plays could be communicated instantly. Audibles adjusted without elaborate sideline pantomimes. But the system wasn't perfect. The league allowed only one designated player per offense to have a live headset, and the line cut off with 15 seconds left on the play clock. That created a margin for improvisation and for doubt. If the system malfunctioned, as it often did in the early years, teams had to fall back on signals, code words, and backup methods. And so, the paranoia grew. Teams suspected that their opponents were tampering with frequencies, causing static, even eavesdropping. It wasn't far-fetched. In a sport where inches determined legacies, knowing the other team's intentions was priceless. Former quarterback Kurt Warner once admitted that he worried about defenders knowing too much when he broke the huddle, describing moments when linebackers called out his plays before the snap. Whether they had decoded signals, memorized tendencies, or simply gotten lucky, it reinforced the sense that secrecy was slipping through cracks. Then came the scandal that redefined how fans thought about secrecy in football: Spygate. In 2007, reports surfaced that the New England Patriots had been videotaping the signals of opposing coaches from unauthorized locations. The league investigation confirmed that Belichick's staff had collected sideline signals and attempted to match them with plays during games. The Patriots were fined heavily, docked a first-round draft pick, and Belichick himself was fined $500,000, the largest fine ever imposed on a coach. The scandal wasn't about the existence of signals everyone knew those were vulnerable, but about the systematic weaponization of surveillance. Defensive coordinators like Buddy Ryan once prided themselves on reading body language, watching for tells in offensive linemen, or spotting tendencies in formation. Spygate suggested something far colder: that the game could be broken down into data, cataloged, and exploited like code. It wasn't against the spirit of competition. It was against the written rules of how information could be gathered. Players were split on what it meant. Some minimized it, saying signal stealing was as old as the sport. Others believed it crossed a line, not because stealing signs was new, but because the technological edge made it relentless. Tony Dungy, respected for his calm leadership, argued that while everyone tried to read signals, using cameras to catalog and archive them created an unfair imbalance. The controversy left fans with the sense that maybe the real battles weren't always on the field, but in the hidden spaces where data and deception collided. And yet, secrecy survived. Even after the NFL banned videotaping and tightened headset rules, coaches adapted. Sidelines grew more theatrical. Coordinators held play sheets in front of their mouths. Assistants gestured wildly. And backup quarterbacks in baseball caps performed decoy signals just to throw off potential eyes. Some teams rotated entire sets of signals from week to week. Others relied on dummy callers who intentionally gave fake instructions. It was a hall of mirrors, a dance between truth and misdirection. But the paranoia wasn't confined to sidelines. Even inside locker rooms and meeting halls, secrecy was treated like sacred ritual. Former lineman Jeff Saturday once described how Peyton Manning guarded his playbook as if it were state secrets. Some teams printed theirs on paper that dissolved in water. Others installed digital systems that self-deleted files after a set time. The playbook had transformed from a leather binder to a database, protected like an intelligence dossier. Technology had modernized the cat-and-mouse game, but it had not eliminated it. If anything, it raised the stakes. Belichick wasn't the only coach accused of pushing limits. Stories circulated about hidden microphones, about radio frequencies being jammed in hostile stadiums, about suspiciously malfunctioning headsets in crucial games. None of these were ever proven, but in a league where billion-dollar franchises depended on razor-thin advantages, suspicion became as much a part of the culture as competition itself. Defenses evolved to meet this challenge. Coordinators like Rex Ryan or Wade Phillips knew that if offenses could deliver plays with machine-like precision, then defenses had to disguise their intentions with equal sophistication. Zone blitzes, hybrid coverages, and simulated pressures were designed not just to disrupt quarterbacks physically, but mentally. By the 2000s, disguising coverage had become as elaborate as disguising signals. Safeties crept forward only to bail at the snap. Linebackers feigned blitzes they never intended to deliver. The secrecy of the playbook extended onto the field itself, deception written into live action. The NFL eventually mandated uniform headset rules for both offense and defense, allowing one defensive player the green dot helmet to communicate with coaches. That, too, changed the landscape. Defenders no longer relied solely on sideline signals. The Mike linebacker often became the general, relaying plays with his own voice. But even then, there were limits. What if the headset failed? What if noise drowned it out? Teams still had to prepare with redundant signals, multiple systems layered over each other like encryption codes. The secrecy wasn't just about avoiding theft, it was about maintaining control in chaos. In 2014, Aaron Rodgers openly admitted that he used a variety of dummy calls at the line to throw off defenders who thought they knew his cadence. Manning famously barked Omaha so many times that it became a national joke, but each time it served as both communication and distraction. That was the beauty of secrecy in football. Sometimes the loudest signals were the most misleading. As technology pushed the sport forward, the question remained, had football lost something by allowing communication to become so mediated? Older players often argued that the human element, the subtlety of reading lips or decoding body language, was part of the game's romance. Now, with headsets and encrypted digital playbooks, the walls were higher, the locks more secure. Yet the suspicion never vanished, because in football, just as in war, the moment you believed your system was secure was the moment you were most vulnerable. That's the paradox of the NFL's secret playbooks in the age of technology. The tools may change, but the need for secrecy never dies. The paranoia, the layers of deception, the constant fear that someone is listening or watching it, all keeps the sport's undercurrent of espionage alive. And as much as fans love the highlight reels, the deep passes, and the bone-crunching tackles, the hidden war of information is what makes the NFL's inner circle feel like a vault. Because when I look at the evolution of this era, from the early static-filled headsets to the Spygate headlines to the elaborate sideline theatrics of today, I see a game still haunted by the same truth. In football, information is power, and power is never given freely. Stolen, guarded, and endlessly fought over. I've always believed football is a game of information disguised as violence. What happens on the field may look like brute force. A receiver sprinting down the sideline. A linebacker crashing into the gap. A quarterback drilling a pass between defenders. But underneath it all lies something invisible. Who knows what? Kana knows, and in the shadow of Spygate. In the years where technology became both a tool and a weapon, the playbook itself transformed into something stranger. It wasn't just a set of diagrams anymore. It was a shield, a disguise, a labyrinth of misdirection that only the most disciplined minds could navigate. After Belichick and the Patriots were caught videotaping signals, the league tried to slam the brakes on surveillance. Rules were tightened, penalties established, oversight increased. But in football, just as in war, tightening the rules rarely kills innovation. It simply forces it underground. Coaches and coordinators began to build countermeasures, layers of deception that went far beyond scribbled X's and O's. Some of these methods bordered on psychological warfare. Entire sections of practice time were dedicated not to perfecting plays, but to disguising them. Quarterbacks would shout fake audibles at the line, coded words designed to trigger panic in defenses who thought they'd cracked the pattern. Sideline assistants would wave in dummy signals, elaborate pantomimes that carried no meaning, intended only to clutter the opposition's mental bandwidth. I once heard a former assistant describe it this way. We had 3 signal callers giving hand signs. 1 was live, 2 were decoys. Sometimes none of them were real. The entire point was to make the other sideline waste time chasing shadows. The deeper I looked into these stories, the more I realized that secret playbooks weren't just physical binders or encrypted tablets. They had become living organisms, full of dead ends and traps. They functioned like codes that required not only deciphering, but resisting the temptation to chase false leads. Think of Chip Kelly's Oregon offenses in the late 2000s. And later, his stint in the NFL. His system thrived on speed, on pushing the tempo before defenses could breathe. But tempo was only half the trick. On the sidelines, assistants held up giant placards plastered with random images. Cartoons, celebrities, symbols. A bizarre collage that seemed nonsensical. To an untrained eye, it looked absurd. But for players, it was a quick read key to the next play. For opponents, it was another layer of misdirection. Was SpongeBob SquarePants telling the Ducks to run a screen? Was a picture of Kim Kardashian a signal for a sweep? Nobody outside that huddle could know. That same philosophy filtered into the NFL in quieter ways. Teams began hiring specialists not to create plays, but to camouflage them. They studied the rhythm of play calling, the cadence of certain quarterbacks, the micro signals given by linemen before the snap, and then they engineered ways to mask those tendencies. Offensive linemen were taught to make this same foot stomp, whether it was a run or a pass. Running backs practiced holding their eyes in identical directions, regardless of whether they were about to block or slip out for a screen. Belichick himself once said, "The less you tell with your body, the more you control the game." He wasn't just talking about execution, he was talking about the art of keeping secrets. But if deception was the weapon of choice, then paranoia was its side effect. I've spoken to players who said they were convinced, utterly convinced, that opposing teams were still stealing their calls, no matter how many dummy signals they used. Some swore that playbooks themselves had been cloned. Stories circulated of lost binders turning up in rivals' hands, of former assistants leaking terminology to their new employers. One linebacker told me, "The hardest hits didn't come from a blitz. They came from realizing they knew your play before you ran it." And so another layer was added to the culture. Counterintelligence. Teams began crafting false playbooks, deliberately planting them in circulation. Young assistants carried binders that looked official but contained nothing but nonsense. Quarterbacks rehearsed fake sequences in pre-game warm-ups, baiting scouts into jotting down ghosts. The playbook was no longer a guide to winning. It was a lure, a trap designed to punish anyone foolish enough to peek behind the curtain. This wasn't paranoia without precedent. The echoes reach back to military strategy. Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is based on deception, and the NFL, whether it admits it or not, embraced the same ethos. Coaches like Mike Shanahan and John Gruden were known for designing entire packages they never intended to use, but carried just to bait opponents into preparing for threats that weren't real. Those phantom plays lived in the playbook but never saw daylight, serving only to sap time and resources from the enemy. And it wasn't confined to the sidelines. On the field, the deception went deeper. Peyton Manning turned the audible into performance art, famously barking long strings of words. Omaha, Omaha. Some real, most not. Defensive coordinators studied his cadence endlessly, yet Manning thrived because he made the entire operation a riddle. By the time they thought they had cracked it, he had already moved to the next layer of disguise. Even defenders began adopting the same logic. Safeties disguised coverages until the last possible second. Cornerbacks feigned blitzes only to backpedal at the snap. Linebackers held neutral stances to mask their intentions. The deception spread like wildfire, and the playbook became less about what was written and more about what could be concealed. Looking back, what fascinates me is not just the tactical brilliance, but the psychological strain it placed on everyone involved. Players had to memorize 2, sometimes 3, entire systems. One for execution, one for disguise, and one for counter-disguise. The mental load was staggering. Imagine preparing for a playoff game, knowing that every word, every signal, every movement might be both real and fake simultaneously. It blurred the boundary between preparation and paranoia, between strategy and subterfuge. The NFL will never fully admit how much deception drives its heart. Officially, it is a league of fairness, of competition, of sport. But beneath that polished surface lies something closer to espionage. Secret languages, dummy codes, misdirection layered upon misdirection. The playbook, once thought of as a sacred manual, evolved into something far more elusive. A mirror maze where the truth was always distorted, always hidden just behind the next turn. And yet, this era of camouflage set the stage for something even more transformative. Because if misdirection was the old frontier, data would soon become the new one. Coaches realized that information wasn't just something to hide, it was something to weaponize. Analytics, tendencies, percentages, predictive models. The digital age promised not only to protect secrets, but to create new ones. The secret playbooks of the past had been written in ink. The secret playbooks of the future would be written in code. And as the NFL stepped into that digital age, the chessboard expanded once more. This wasn't just about who could call the cleverest audible or disguise the sharpest blitz. It became about who could process more information faster, and who could bury that information deep enough that no rival could ever touch it. The playbook was no longer paper. It was algorithm, it was probability, it was data stitched into strategy. And with that evolution came new opportunities and new dangers. Because in the NFL, every edge, every advantage is temporary. Once one team discovers a secret, others will chase it down, strip it bare, and find their own way to twist it. And so, the game continues. A cycle of revelation and concealment, always one step away from exposure. What started as scribbled lines in a notebook had now become a technological arms race. And in that race, the stakes had never been higher. When the NFL first began, secrecy was physical. Coaches clutched clipboards, assistants carried binders that had to be locked in offices. And signals were whispered on the sideline with a hand cupped over the mouth, afraid of lip readers. But as the league grew, as the stakes grew, the idea of a secret playbook expanded far beyond paper. It entered the digital age. And with it came something no one could have imagined in the 1960s or 70s spreadsheets that could decode tendencies. Databases that held a season's worth of disguises, and encrypted tablets that turned locker rooms into war rooms. I remember when the first whispers of analytics began filtering into the NFL conversation. It was around the early 2000s, and the league dismissed it at first. Baseball had already embraced the Moneyball revolution. But football was different too, so everyone thought. Too chaotic, too violent, too unpredictable for math to solve. Yet behind the scenes, forward-thinking coaches and executives were quietly hiring quants, men and women who didn't wear cleats, but instead stared at screens, crunching numbers until patterns emerged. They weren't looking to build better players. They were looking to build better secrets. The modern secret playbook wasn't just X's and O's anymore. It was probabilities. If a team lined up in a certain formation on second down, in the middle of the field, there was a 62% chance they would run left. If the tight end motioned across the line, that percentage might swing in the opposite direction. Suddenly, defense wasn't reacting. It was predicting. And that prediction was stored in a database, carried onto the field in the brains of coordinators, and increasingly, in the tablets that quarterbacks and linebackers reviewed between drives. Bill Belichick was one of the first to fully grasp this shift. He'd always been a master of detail, but when analytics became available, he used it to refine his already encyclopedic understanding of opponents. Patriots players have recalled sitting in film sessions where Belichick would pause the tape, point to a seemingly minor detail, and say, "Watch this guard's hand. If it shifts that way, it's a draw." 90% of the time. To players, it felt like clairvoyance. To Belichick, it was just information hidden in plain sight, uncovered by hours of data review. But secrecy cuts both ways. If defenses could predict offenses, then offenses had to evolve. That meant hiding signals better, disguising formations more deeply, even scripting plays in ways that defied statistical expectation. Coaches began using self-scouting analytics, turning the mathematical lens on themselves to find out if their play calling had become predictable. It was paranoia, elevated into strategy, and the new secret playbooks reflected it all. They weren't just binders anymore, were encrypted files, locked behind team servers, guarded as closely as nuclear codes. The technology itself reshaped the battlefield. The NFL's partnership with Microsoft put Surface tablets on every sideline. What looked like a simple device became a vault of classified information. Within seconds of a play ending, photos of defensive alignments were in the hands of quarterbacks. Coordinators could upload sequences directly to their units, highlighting tendencies in real time. And the digital playbook meant that every player carried the team's intellectual property in their backpack. Their tablet holding hundreds of plays, adjustments, and secret codes. That introduced a new kind of fear. What if the secrets leaked? Players traded. Coaches fired. Tablets lost. The NFL had to implement strict controls requiring teams to encrypt their digital playbooks, sometimes even erasing them remotely if a device went missing. Stories began to surface of a cut player walking into another team's facility just days later, carrying fragments of the old playbook still stored in memory. One veteran once admitted, "If you're cut, you've still got all the plays. You could sell them, you could trade them. But there's an unspoken code that you don't." Still, the paranoia was real. Analytics didn't just change the playbook, it changed preparation. Teams began simulating entire games digitally, running thousands of possibilities through algorithms to determine which plays had the highest chance of success against a particular opponent. It was no longer enough to simply watch film. Film was just the raw material. The true advantage came in breaking that film down frame by frame, quantifying every movement, every alignment, every split-second decision. And yet, in this digital arms race, another layer of secrecy emerged. Teams began building what you could call counter-analytics, essentially fake tendencies. A team might deliberately run the ball on 3rd and long for 2 or 3 weeks just to create a false data trail. Then, when the opponent's database screamed run, they would hit with a deep pass. This was secrecy wrapped inside deception. Technology used not only to gain an advantage, but to weaponize predictability itself. Consider how much trust this required. A coach had to trust that his analysts were right. A quarterback had to trust that the tablet in his hands was empty, just filled with noise, but with actual insight. And everyone had to trust that their secrets wouldn't be stolen. Because if they were, the advantage flipped. In 2007, the Patriots' infamous Spygate scandal revealed how fragile this balance was. The accusation wasn't that Belichick invented cheating, it was that technology had made it easier. And the boundary between preparation and espionage was thinner than ever. The scandal proved something. In the digital age, secrets weren't just vulnerable on the field. They were vulnerable in the cloud. As I reflect on this shift, I realize that the essence of the secret playbook didn't change, was always about knowledge that one side had and the other didn't. What changed was the scope. Once, it was about who could memorize the most formations. Now, it was about who could process the most information the fastest. Once, the danger was losing a binder. Now, it was a hacked server. The playbook had become not just a book, but a database of probabilities. And controlling that database was the difference between victory and defeat. Players, too, felt the weight of this transformation. Many came from eras where instinct ruled, where a linebacker read a quarterback's eyes, or a receiver trusted his gut on a route. Suddenly, they were being told, "The numbers say, do this." Some embraced it, seeing analytics as a lifeline to prolong their careers. Others rejected it, believing it stripped the soul out of the game. But no one could deny its impact. The secret playbook had become something bigger than any one person. It was the collective brain of the franchise, distilled into code. And maybe that's where the NFL reflects something larger about our world. Secrets once lived in vaults, in locked rooms, in whispered words. Now they live in data. And like all data, they are both powerful and fragile, priceless and perishable. The secret playbook is no longer just a stack of pages. It's a living thing, constantly updated, constantly protected, constantly at risk of being exposed. The question that lingers, though, is whether this reliance on numbers has made the game better or more vulnerable. When a coordinator trusts an algorithm more than a hunch, when a quarterback scrolls through a tablet instead of listening to his gut, Has the game gained an edge or lost a piece of its humanity? That tension between instinct and information is now the most guarded secret of all. Because in the NFL, knowledge is power. But too much knowledge exposed, hacked, or stolen can bring everything crashing down. And as I look at the game today, I realize the most dangerous playbook isn't just the one in a coach's hands. It's the one stored in the cloud, hidden behind a password, carrying the fate of a franchise in every line of code. I remember sitting in the dim light of a film room, the projector humming behind me, while a coach scribbled frantic notes on a whiteboard. To an outsider, the chalk diagrams looked like geometry class gone mad arrows, slashes, letters that made little sense. To us, those markings weren't just X's and O's, they were survival maps. Demands carved into our memory, silent expectations that weighed as heavily as the pads strapped to our shoulders. The secret playbooks weren't just ink and paper. They were living organisms, mutating week after week, sometimes day after day. And it was the players who carried their burden. On the surface, football is a game of talent, strength, and will. But beneath the helmets, beneath the roars of the crowd, players lived in a constant cycle of memorization, anticipation, and fear of forgetting. Some would tell you that stepping onto the field felt easier than walking into those meetings. On game day, you could rely on instinct, adrenaline, and preparation. But in the locker room, with coaches drilling endless variations of a scheme, the real battle was mental. A missed cue, a forgotten wrinkle in a play that only appeared on page 74 of a 3-inch thick binder, could cost not only the game, but your job. I remember one veteran offensive lineman telling me, the hardest hits don't come from a linebacker. They come from that moment when you realize you don't know the play, that panic that's worse than a concussion. His words stuck with me because they revealed something rarely discussed. Football's secrecy and complexity aren't just weapons against opponents. They're weights chained to the players themselves. Coaches designed playbooks to be fluid. Plays were added and removed constantly, designed to outwit defenses that studied just as relentlessly. But while a coach could flip to a new page, a player had to internalize it, committing routes, protections, and checks to muscle memory within hours. Receivers, for example, sometimes had to memorize not just a route tree, but multiple variations of the same route depending on the coverage. Linebackers were expected to recognize offensive tendencies disguised under layers of misdirection. And quarterbacks, the keepers of the most knowledge, bore the responsibility of translating it all in real time. The mental strain was crushing. A quarterback once told Sports Illustrated, "I felt like I was playing 3 games every Sunday. The one in my head, the one on the field, and the one I replayed in nightmares." For him, the secret playbooks weren't just strategy. They were a source of sleepless nights. And then there was the paranoia. Coaches guarded their playbooks with almost obsessive intensity. Players were lectured about leaving binders in cars or hotel rooms. Some organizations even issued tablets locked with software that could erase everything remotely if lost. It wasn't only about preventing opponents from gaining an edge. It was about controlling who had access even within the team. Younger players often had less information than veterans. Backup quarterbacks were given trimmed-down versions of the playbook, just enough to function in an emergency, but not the full architecture. In some locker rooms, secrecy existed even among teammates. That secrecy bred a kind of isolation. Players weren't free to admit confusion. Asking too many questions was seen as weakness, a sign that you couldn't handle the mental load. You didn't want to be that guy, one safety told me. The guy who needed extra time, who couldn't keep up. Because in this league, if you can't keep up mentally, it doesn't matter how fast or strong you are, you'll be gone. The irony is that the very system designed to empower players often became their prison. Analytics only deepened the maze. With technology, coaches dissected every movement, how a player stepped, how quickly he reacted, whether he hesitated by even half a second. Every flaw became another reason to tweak the playbook, another adjustment piled onto an already fragile mental state. For some, the constant evolution felt like drowning. A wide receiver once admitted privately that he de-simplified the playbook, himself creating his own shorthand system just to survive. "I couldn't carry all of it in my head," he said. "So I built my own code. I prayed it would match what the coaches wanted." Most of the time, it worked. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, I got screamed at. The pressure wasn't confined to Sundays. During practice, every rep was filmed, every mistake cataloged. Coaches would replay errors in front of the entire team, freezing the frame to highlight a misstep, a hesitation, a mental lapse. The humiliation cut deeper than any hit. A linebacker once told me, "The pain of being knocked out cold fades. The pain of being called out in that room that never leaves." It's easy to admire the innovation of football's secret playbooks, the trick plays, the disguised formations, the chess-like elegance. But behind every brilliant design were men shouldering the crushing weight of perfection. They lived in fear of being exposed, of failing to carry the intellectual burden demanded by the game. For every touchdown born of a brilliant scheme, there was a sleepless night spent staring at diagrams, running routes in the mind, whispering counts under the breath. Some players thrived in this atmosphere. Peyton Manning was famous for obsessively studying every detail, often treating the playbook like scripture. Tom Brady once said, "You don't memorize a playbook. You live it, you breathe it, until it becomes you." For them, the mental strain was fuel. But for many others, it was a quiet torment, a hidden cost of the game. And that torment carried consequences. Mental fatigue translated into physical mistakes. A misread led to a blown assignment, which could lead to injury. A lineman who forgot a blocking shift left a quarterback exposed to a blindside hit. A safety who hesitated in coverage could give up a game-winning touchdown. The stakes of mental failure weren't just reputational, they were physical, brutal, sometimes career-ending. Even off the field, the secrecy followed them. Families rarely understood the weight players carried. Spouses would see them pacing at night, scribbling notes, watching film until dawn. Children would ask why dad wasn't home, not realizing that the hours spent in the film room were as essential as the hours spent in the weight room. In many ways, the secret playbooks defined the gap between the myth of football and its reality. Fans cheered the spectacle of Sunday, the touchdowns and interceptions, the visible drama. But players lived a second, invisible drama, relentless battle inside their minds. Their triumph wasn't just physical domination, it was the act of surviving the weight of endless pages, the fear of forgetting, the burden of secrecy that few outside the locker room could ever understand. As I reflect on it, I realize that the brilliance of the NFL has always come at a price. The hidden playbooks weren't just tactical advantages. They were crucibles, shaping players not only by what they could do with their bodies, but by what they could endure with their minds. Some emerged sharper, stronger, legends carved from intellect as much as muscle. Others quietly faded, casualties of a system that demanded total mental submission. And in that tension lies the truth. The secret playbooks were never just about football. They were about control, about survival, about the quiet cost of brilliance. They made the game what it is, dazzling, unpredictable, thrilling. But they also left scars, invisible ones, etched into the minds of those who carried their weight. This was the untold story of players under the burden of secrecy, analytics, and the never-ending churn of evolving playbooks. A story not of glory, but of endurance. I remember the quietest battles were never played under stadium lights. They didn't echo across the Sunday broadcasts or find their way into highlight reels. No, the real fights lived in back rooms, behind closed doors. In whispered exchanges between coaches and quarterbacks, in the sealed envelopes of game plans passed down like sacred scrolls. This was the war of secrecy, where knowledge was power. and the thin line between dominance and collapse rested on whether you could hide your hand just long enough to outwit the man across from you. Inside every team, the pressure to conceal the playbook became its own culture of paranoia. Quarterbacks were warned not to leave notebooks lying around. Assistants were told to burn old scripts after film sessions. Coaches wrote decoy plays on whiteboards in case a curious janitor or rival scout got too close. I remember hearing one veteran describe it as living inside a vault. You didn't just learn football, you learned espionage. Because if one page of those secret designs slipped outside the walls of the facility, it could tilt the entire balance of a season. Yet secrecy wasn't just a matter of protecting the X's and O's. It was about protecting identity. A team's playbook wasn't simply strategy. It was its DNA, its heartbeat. Coaches like Bill Walsh or Tom Landry built philosophies that reached beyond diagrams. These were ideas about tempo, rhythm, deception, and execution. To lose that to a rival wasn't just tactically, it was existential. Imagine if your enemy not only knew your weapons, but understood the rhythm of your breathing. That's what made secrecy such a heavy burden for quarterbacks. They weren't just the executors of plays, they were guardians of trust. And yet, while those internal battles raged, the outside world added gasoline to the fire. The cultural obsession with football in America made secrecy even harder to keep. Reporters circled like hawks, hunting for hints of innovation. Television analysts dissected every formation, replayed every audible, zoomed into sideline gestures, looking for cracks in the armor. Fans in the stands weren't just cheering anymore, they became amateur scouts, uploading grainy footage, sharing theories about hidden codes and hand signals. Every gesture, every subtle shift of a lineman's stance was suddenly up for public interpretation. It was this dual-pressure internal paranoia and external scrutiny that made life at quarterback feel suffocating. You had to perform while guarding a vault, improvise while keeping secrets, inspire a locker room while suspecting that someone in the room might leak a sliver of knowledge. Former quarterback Trent Green once admitted, "I never stopped looking over my shoulder, not just for defenders, but for the idea that someone out there already knew what I was about to do." That confession lingers because it tells you that the greatest battles weren't just physical. They were psychological, spiritual even. The culture of secrecy created a strange kind of loneliness inside the game. Quarterbacks would walk into meeting rooms where even assistants weren't told the full plan, only fragments. Coaches would deliberately lie to their own players during the week, disguising which plays were real and which were smokescreens, revealing the truth only hours before kickoff. Imagine existing in a profession where deception wasn't just a weapon, it was a daily discipline, practiced on friend and foe alike. But the external culture only reinforced the obsession. The 1980s and 90s were eras when football became less a sport and more a national ritual. And in rituals, myths are born. Fans wanted to believe in magic, in the idea that their quarterback was orchestrating brilliance unseen by the common eye. This fed into the mystique of secret playbooks, into the idea that somewhere in the shadows existed a master plan that only a chosen few were allowed to glimpse. When a trick play worked, it was hailed as genius. When it failed, it was dissected with almost surgical cruelty, as if the coach had betrayed a sacred trust. I can't help but reflect on how secrecy became addictive. The more a playbook was hidden, the more powerful it seemed, even if the plays themselves weren't revolutionary. Teams guarded information not always because of its value, but because of its perceived value. It created a feedback loop: hoard knowledge, leak less, generate more mystique. And in that mystique, football found another layer of its culture: mythology built on silence. Yet this came with costs. Players grew distrustful of one another. Rivalries didn't just exist between teams, but sometimes within locker rooms, as suspicion bled into relationships. Who had access to the real game plan? Who knew the audibles? Who might talk to a reporter off the record? The secrecy demanded unity, but often fractured it. And all the while, fans, analysts, and media fueled the fire by demanding answers, demanding explanations, demanding access to a world built on denial. Think about it. The quarterback position, already the most visible, was also the most isolated. Expected to be transparent leaders, but also silent vaults. Expected to inspire teammates, but also conceal truths from them until the final moment. That tension was unbearable for some. Stories circulated of quarterbacks burning out not from hits to the body, but from hits to the psyche. One former coach admitted off record, "By December, half my quarterbacks weren't just hurt, they were paranoid. They didn't trust anyone, including me." And still, the game went on. Because secrecy wasn't just paranoia, it was spectacle. The more teams concealed, the more the public craved revelation. This tug of war between silence and exposure fueled the league itself. Media empires thrived on speculation about secret strategies, turning whispers into headlines, building intrigue that sold tickets and ad space. The NFL, for all its guarded culture, benefited from this external obsession. The myth of secrecy gave football its aura of chess-like depth, of war room brilliance, of a game that existed beyond the obvious collisions on the field. In that sense, the internal battles and external fuel weren't separate forces. They were symbiotic. The secrecy fed the culture, and the culture demanded more secrecy. Quarterbacks were trapped in the middle, playing both sides of the divide. Guardians of truth in a world obsessed with uncovering it. And when I look back now, I realize this may have been the most dangerous game of all, not the hits, not the sacks, but the endless demand to balance deception with performance, silence with leadership, isolation with visibility. Because in football, the playbook was never just a playbook. It was mythology. It was identity. And it was the most carefully guarded treasure in American sports. I've come to realize that the NFL has always been two games at once. The one we saw on Sunday afternoons cheering fans, bright lights, the ball spiraling through the air. And the one we never saw, the hidden negotiations, the coded playbooks, the veiled strategies fought not just on the field, but inside the walls of every organization. The NFL's most compelling story isn't only about touchdowns or trophies. It's about secrecy versus exposure, innovation versus tradition, trust versus paranoia. Inside that tension lived the league's most guarded playbooks. And within those playbooks burned an internal battle every team carried how much to reveal, how much to hide, how much to risk in the pursuit of both victory and survival. Coaches often described football as chess, but in reality, it was closer to Cold War espionage. Just like rival nations keeping nuclear blueprints locked away, NFL teams kept their plays chained to secrecy. Internally, staff members argued about what should stay buried and what could be shared. Quarterbacks demanded transparency so they could master every wrinkle. Linebackers begged to know more about tendencies in order to anticipate movements. Yet, at the same time, coaches worried that the more widely knowledge spread, the greater the risk of betrayal or leaks. Loose lips sink ships. As one assistant coach muttered in a 1980s NFL Films interview, and one wrong conversation at a bar can sink an entire season. This battle inside locker rooms was constant. Some coaches thrived on openness. Bill Walsh, for example, believed his West Coast offense worked best when players deeply understood its philosophy. He explained timing, spacing, and progression so thoroughly that the system became second nature. Others, like Bill Parcells or Buddy Ryan, locked the doors tighter. They gave players just enough to do their job, no more. Their belief was simple. The fewer who knew the full picture, the harder it was for rivals to uncover it. And when teams clashed, these philosophical divides shaped entire eras of the game. But while those internal struggles played out, there was another battle raging outside cultural fuel feeding secrecy itself. America loved the mythology of the hidden code. From spy novels to government conspiracies. From the mystique of Area 51 to classified war files, the American imagination thrived on secrets. The NFL tapped into that cultural pulse. Fans believed their team's playbook was more than just a stack of diagrams. It was an arcane manual, almost sacred, like a forbidden text in a locked vault. Broadcasters leaned into that drama, often hinting at unseen pages or schemes we're not allowed to describe. The league didn't correct them, it benefited from it. Every mention of secret strategies turned Sunday football into something bigger than sport. And this external narrative looped back inside the teams themselves. Players grew up in that culture. Many entered the league already believing their playbook was a weapon of national importance. You'd guard it like it was a military codebook. Former linebacker Mike Singletary once recalled, "You didn't just leave it in your car. You didn't leave it in a locker." That was war intel. The culture around football made secrecy feel patriotic. It wasn't paranoia, it was duty. But that duty came with consequences. Inside organizations, secrecy often bred distrust. Rookie players were deliberately kept in the dark longer than veterans. Assistants were sometimes excluded from full game plans until the night before kickoff. Teams installed surveillance measures in their own facilities to prevent leaks. This atmosphere created an undercurrent of suspicion anxiety that if even one person slipped, decades of innovation could unravel. Yet paradoxically, that same suspicion bonded teams tighter. Players felt they were part of something clandestine, something worth defending at all costs. Externally, the public fascination only intensified the stakes. Sports writers fueled the myth by reporting on secret formations or classified trick plays. Broadcasters replayed rare, unusual formations like they were glimpses into a hidden scripture, and fans responded with awe. The secrecy became part of the entertainment itself, an invisible spectacle layered over the visible one. Even when plays weren't truly new, the perception of secrecy gave them an aura. A simple misdirection run could feel like something born in a laboratory, hidden away until the perfect moment. What fascinates me most, looking back, is how much secrecy became theater. Coaches often staged cloak-and-dagger operations less because they needed to, and more because the culture demanded it. They'd dim lights in film rooms, plant fake plays in discarded notes, or guard practice fields with tarps and armed security. In truth, many of these precautions were overkill, but they created an atmosphere, a performance of secrecy that convinced everyone players. Fans, rivals that what they held was priceless knowledge. And in a way, that belief itself gave the playbooks power. Yet, as with any performance, cracks appeared. The internal battles over secrecy sometimes led to catastrophic collapses. In the 1990s, the Cleveland Browns reportedly struggled because their young quarterbacks couldn't fully grasp an offense deliberately withheld from them until late in the season. By the time they understood, it was too late. On the other side, teams that leaned into transparency often thrived. When Mike Shanahan taught his Denver Broncos every nuance of his zone-blocking schemes, the players didn't just execute plays, they adapted them in real time, creating unstoppable rushing attacks that powered Super Bowl victories. Secrecy could suffocate just as easily as it could protect. And culturally, the obsession with secrecy sometimes warped reality. Fans demanded drama, so journalists fed it. Stories about never-before-seen plays circulated constantly, even when those plays were minor variations of older ones. The myth outgrew the substance. Coaches leaned into it because myth kept opponents guessing. But the deeper truth is that most secrets were evolutionary, not revolutionary. Yet no one wanted to admit it. In a culture intoxicated by secrecy, truth became secondary to perception. As I reflect on these dual battles, the internal and the cultural I, see how they reinforced each other. Inside, teams fought over how much to conceal. Outside, fans and media glorified the very act of concealment. Together, they created a self-sustaining cycle. The league became a stage where secrecy wasn't just a tactic, it was an identity. To be an NFL team wasn't just to win games, It was to convince the world you possessed knowledge no one else could access. This duality shaped everything. It shaped how playbooks were written, distributed, and memorized. It shaped how fans consumed the sport. It even shaped the psychology of players who lived in a constant state of guarding, protecting, and defending ideas many of them didn't fully understand. And it shaped the culture of football in America itself, embedding secrecy into the DNA of the sport as deeply as toughness, strategy, or spectacle. When I think about the NFL's secret playbooks now, I don't just think of X's and O's. I think of dimly lit meeting rooms where young players strain to understand concepts withheld from them. I think of fans glued to their televisions, convinced they were glimpsing forbidden pages when a trick play unfolded. I think of a sport that thrived not just on competition, but on the tension between revelation and concealment. And I realized the NFL wasn't just America's game because it was violent, or strategic, or unified. It was America's game because it mirrored America's obsession with secrets, codes, and the power of hidden knowledge. And so, the story of the secret playbook was never just about football. It was about the human need to believe in mysteries, the thrill of guarding something sacred, and the danger of what happens when secrecy becomes both weapon and theater. Internally, teams lived that struggle every day. Externally, culture demanded they play it out for all to see. Together, those forces built the mythology of the NFL's most secretive era. This ISNT, the end of the story at S, the moment we begin to see how secrecy didn't just protect plays, but redefined the very identity of football itself. I've often said that football is not just a sport, it's a culture of codes, silence, and unwritten laws. If the previous chapter showed us the internal battles of secrecy and the cultural fuel that stoked them, then this chapter asks an even sharper question. What happens when the very silence that protects a team becomes the very silence that destroys the players who lived inside it? To understand that, we have to look at two forces running in parallel on one side, the tactical genius of hidden playbooks that promised victory. On the other, the mounting toll on the men who were forced to carry out strategies they barely understood. In systems where secrecy came before their own bodies and minds. The 1980s and 1990s, in particular, revealed how deep this paradox ran. Organizations began locking away more than just trick plays and experimental schemes. Medical records, concussion protocols, and even sideline observations were treated with the same guarded intensity as playbooks. A former lineman told a reporter years later, "They told us not to talk to anyone about the symptoms. Not your family, not the press, not even other guys in the locker room. Just ice it, tape it, and shut up." The language of silence was so embedded in football culture that players confused it with loyalty. And loyalty, in turn, blurred into obedience. From the outside, America adored the spectacle. The NFL had become Sunday's most reliable religion. Stadiums filled with chants, living rooms buzzed with cable broadcasts. And entire cities were defined by the fortunes of their teams. That kind of cultural obsession gave organizations all the cover they needed to keep their internal battles hidden. Fans demanded dominance, and dominance required secrecy. To speak out was to betray not just a coach or a franchise, but an entire city's pride. But secrecy is never clean. It breeds unevenly, spilling into areas it was never meant to touch. By the 1990s, journalists began noticing odd contradictions. Teams had advanced knowledge of certain opponents' signals, or mysterious last-minute personnel changes that gave them an edge. It wasn't espionage in the Hollywood sense, but a cultural extension of the same secrecy that had governed hidden playbooks for decades. A defensive coach once admitted, anonymously, "We all knew teams spied on each other. We all did it. The only sin was getting caught." In that one line, you can hear the merging of the internal and external, the private codes inside organizations, bleeding out into the wider culture of the league. And yet, as much as secrecy served as a shield, it also became a sword that cut into the men on the field. The same silence that kept playbooks locked away was applied to brain injuries, prescription drug use, and mental health struggles. When a player staggered after a hit, a coach might call it just getting your bell rung. But inside, the player felt a quiet terror. Should he report it and risk being labeled weak, or should he stay silent and protect the team's strategic edge? Over and over, players chose silence. And the silence became culture. I think of Buddy Ryan here, not because he was unique in creating defensive schemes, but because he exemplified the mentality of secrecy as an organizing principle. His 46 defense wasn't just about pressure, was about unpredictability. To preserve that unpredictability, Ryan demanded a code of silence. His players bought in, not just because they trusted him, but because the cultural expectation outside those walls rewarded whatever produced victories. Secrecy wasn't an inconvenience, it was currency. The public, meanwhile, didn't want the curtain pulled back. The NFL's growth in the 1990s coincided with America's love for myths of toughness and sacrifice. When players limped back onto the field, fans cheered louder. When defenses anticipated an opponent's calls, it was hailed as brilliance, not suspicion. Even when whispers of systemic deception surfaced, they were drowned out by the cultural roar of just win. In effect, the public became co-conspirators. This is the dangerous paradox of football culture. The same fans who idolized players as warriors also enabled a system that demanded their silence. A linebacker who questioned his health was told he wasn't tough enough. A quarterback who hesitated to reveal a secret play in interviews was accused of lacking leadership. The internal battles of secrecy reinforced themselves because the external culture kept rewarding the results. It was only when careers ended, lives unraveled, that the full cost began to surface. Retired players spoke of addiction, memory loss, depression. Many admitted they had known something was wrong, but never dared to say it out loud. The silence followed them into retirement, and some never escaped it. Journalists finally began to connect the dots. The same culture that had guarded hidden playbooks had also guarded the truth about injuries. The playbook of secrecy, extended beyond X's and O'Sid, had infiltrated the very health of the men who made the game possible. There's a haunting symmetry here. Internally, secrecy was about control, keeping opponents off balance, ensuring an edge. Externally, secrecy was about preservation, protecting the image of the league, feeding the cultural appetite for dominance. Together, they formed a feedback loop. The more secretive organizations became, the more fans romanticized the mystery. And the more fans demanded the spectacle, the more organizations doubled down on silence. But silence has a breaking point. The lawsuits of the early 2000s, the documentaries that exposed the hidden cost of concussions, and the suicides of beloved former players all shattered the old codes. The culture of silence began to fracture. And yet, I can't help but notice, even now, the instinct for secrecy hasn't vanished. Teams still guard playbooks with military precision. Injuries are still downplayed. The internal battles may be more visible today, but the external culture, the craving for toughness, dominance, and mystery remains stubbornly intact. Looking back, I see this chapter of football not as a story of villains and heroes, but as a story of systems. Systems that rewarded secrecy internally, and systems that fueled it externally. The players were trapped in between, celebrated as warriors while privately silenced as men. It is that contradiction, the collision of internal battles and external cultural fuel, that defines so much of the NFL's past, and still lingers in its present. In the world of professional football, playbooks were never just stacks of paper filled with X's and O's. They were repositories of identity, belief, and survival. Inside locker rooms and film study sessions, they shaped how players saw the game and even how they understood their own roles. But outside the stadium, far beyond the chalkboards and projector screens, a new force was at work. The culture itself, the fans, the media, And the myths whispered down through generations took those hidden pages and turned them into something larger than life. This was the moment where secrecy bled into spectacle. The internal battles of protecting a Team S playbook collided with the external hunger of a nation obsessed with football. It wasn't enough to win on the field. The mystique of having something secret, something hidden, something fans believed only a chosen few could access, became its own form of power. For the fans, it was the thrill of imagining a world that existed just out of sight. They didn't just want touchdowns or tackles. They wanted to believe there were layers of the game so complex and so arcane that only the true insiders could understand them. To them, the secret playbook wasn't just about football. It was about being part of a hidden society, a coded world where every motion, every glance, every audibleized word at the line of scrimmage carried deeper meaning. Think about the way fans spoke in bars, living rooms, or tailgates. Every time a quarterback barked out numbers or colors before the snap, the speculation grew. Was it a decoy? Was it a code? Did they just unlock something hidden in the playbook that only their team could know? The cultural obsession gave ordinary moments the flavor of espionage, turning football Sundays into something that felt more like a thriller than a sporting event. The media, always hungry for drama, seized on this cultural fuel. Reporters didn't just cover wins and losses. They speculated on what might be hidden in binders no one outside the organization could ever see. Headlines spoke about secret weapons, about trick plays tucked away, about the hidden chapter in the book. Even when nothing truly radical was hiding inside those pages, the perception mattered more than the reality. NFL films, with its slow-motion montages and iconic narrations, only added to this mythology. When they zoomed in on a coach clutching his play sheet to his chest, shielding it from prying eyes, the effect was cinematic. Viewers weren't just watching football, they were watching a story of secrets, of mystery, of hidden brilliance unfolding behind the curtain. And then came the legends. Certain coaches and quarterbacks became cultural archetypes precisely because of how they were perceived as keepers of the hidden book. Vince Lombardi was lionized not just as a tactician, but as a man whose playbook was seen as sacred scripture. Bill Walsh, with his meticulous West Coast offense, became the prophet of innovation, with stories spreading about how his binders were treated like national treasures. Quarterbacks, too, were cast in this mythology. Joe Montana, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning all were seen as field generals whose understanding of their team's secret schemes was beyond human. Fans believed these men weren't just executing plays, they were decoding hidden chapters in real time, unlocking secrets ordinary mortals couldn't comprehend. The more fans and media fed the myth, the more organizations leaned into it. Teams started using secrecy as part of their identity. The notion of the secret playbook became a weapon not only against opponents, but as a cultural hook for fans. Press conferences dripped with vague references to wrinkles that hadn't yet been revealed. Commentators speculated about plays they're holding back for the playoffs. The mystery became part of the entertainment package, and here lies the fascinating truth. Often the secret wasn't nearly as revolutionary as people imagined. Many of the so-called hidden plays were variations on existing concepts, tweaks in formation, or disguises layered over fundamentals. But the perception of secrecy is the idea that something unknown and potentially game-changing was lurking just beneath the surface was enough to electrify culture. The obsession also revealed something deeper about the American psyche. Football was never just a sport. It was theater, it was ritual, it was war by proxy. The secret playbook fed into the national love of mystery and strategy. Americans grew up with spy stories, Cold War paranoia, tales of codes, and counterintelligence. Football, with its hidden binders and whispered audibles, offered a familiar narrative in a different costume. It was no coincidence that fans and media so eagerly connected the dots between sports and espionage. Both carried the same adrenaline of not knowing what was coming next. The obsession reached its peak during controversies. Anytime rumors swirled about stolen signals, lost playbooks, or videotaping scandals, the cultural machine exploded. When a team was accused of filming another's signals or intercepting communications, the story wasn't just about rule breaking. It was about betrayal of trust, about violating the sacred unwritten code of secrecy. Fans devoured those headlines not because they cared about the technical details of signal interception, but because it tapped into the larger myth they'd built around secret playbooks. The myths also endured because of their generational transfer. Fathers explained to their sons and daughters about the time their team had a hidden trick play no one saw coming. Coaches at the high school level would whisper about plays we're not ready to show yet, borrowing the language of legends from the NFL. The culture itself became self-sustaining, with every level of the game reinforcing the idea that the most important plays were always the ones run on Sundays, but the ones still locked away in the shadows. And in many ways, this cultural obsession became self-fulfilling. The more fans and media glorified secrecy, the more coaches actually worked to protect it. They built thicker walls, stricter protocols, tighter controls, not always because the hidden plays themselves were earth-shattering, but because the perception of possessing hidden knowledge gave them an edge. The myth wasn't just fueled by culture. It was perpetuated by the very institutions that benefited from the illusion. By the turn of the new millennium, the obsession had become so ingrained that it no longer mattered whether or not the secret playbook existed in the way fans imagined it. It was enough that the idea existed. It had become a story the culture couldn't stop telling itself, a story about mystery, control, power, and the intoxicating idea that there was always something hidden just out of reach. So when fans filled stadiums or crowded around televisions, they weren't just watching football. They were watching for the unknown, for the secret, for the hidden page that might finally be revealed. And in that sense, the NFL's secret playbooks weren't just a tool of the game. They had become a mythology fed by fans, sustained by media, immortalized by legends woven so deeply into the cultural fabric that even if no new secrets were ever written, the story would continue forever. When I think about how far we've come, I can't help but pause at this strange tension. The very thing that once gave football its mythic aura, its secrets, its shadows, its whispers has collided headfirst with a world that no longer allows mystery. Technology didn't just creep into football, it stormed the gates. Playbooks that once fit in a coach's briefcase are now encrypted on iPads. Strategies that once unfolded in dimly lit film rooms are now dissected on digital servers where every keystroke can be tracked. Every angle magnified, every data point stored forever. And yet, the irony is impossible to ignore. The NFL, a league built on innovation and spectacle, has also created an ecosystem where secrecy itself has become almost impossible. Or maybe it hasn't disappeared, it's just mutated. I remember the first time I saw a player carrying a tablet instead of a binder. It felt like watching an era dissolve in front of me. No more dog-eared pages, no more scribbled margin notes, no more lost playbook stories like the ones that once fueled locker room legends. In theory, it was cleaner, sharper, safer, but in practice, the stakes got stranger. With every byte of data, the league created not only efficiency, but vulnerability. Now, a single hacked password could be more devastating than a spy with binoculars. A thumb drive in the wrong hands could hold more destructive power than a stolen manila folder ever did. Players adapted quickly, coaches reluctantly. The digital playbook was not optional, it was the future. Teams like the New England Patriots embraced the technology early, and their dominance during the 2000s and 2010s only reinforced the notion that digital precision could create dynasties. But with that precision came paranoia. Suddenly, it wasn't just about what plays you designed, it was about whether you could keep them safe. I spoke once with a retired assistant coach who laughed when I asked about his tablet days. He told me, "We used to guard playbooks like they were nuclear codes. Now we guard passwords the same way." But the problem is nuclear codes don't walk into a bar and forget themselves on the counter. A player can. That comment haunted me because it crystallized something deeper. Secrecy in the NFL was no longer just about physical possession. It was about access, about networks, about the blurred line between the military level security teams claim to enforce and the very human cracks where mistakes inevitably seep through. The digital age didn't just reshape the internal battle, it reshaped the external one too. Fans became smarter, hungrier, armed with tools previous generations couldn't dream of. YouTube film breakdowns, online coaching clinics, and fan-driven analytics sites started doing the kind of work once reserved for NFL insiders. Suddenly, the mystique of the secret playbook was diluted. A fan sitting on his couch could slow down a broadcast clip, annotate coverages, and publish an analysis by morning. Entire communities sprung up online, decoding offenses, predicting tendencies, even catching coaching cues. And then, there was the surveillance culture. Spygate in 2007 wasn't just about videotaping signals, it was a warning shot. It proved that in a digital world, everyone was watching everyone else. And the line between innovation and violation blurred daily. Bill Belichick was branded a genius, a cheater, or both, depending on who you asked. But beyond the scandal, the league faced a larger existential question. How do you regulate secrecy in a world where surveillance is the norm? We live in an era where even the most mundane NFL moments are captured. Sideline cameras, overhead drones, all 22 film available within hours. And millions of eyes breaking it down across platforms. Coaches know this. Players feel it. Every hand signal, every glance, every formation is instantly public property. The secrecy that once defined the game now exists in microseconds. Adjustments happen in real time because they must. If you don't evolve immediately, you're exposed before halftime. But technology cuts both ways. The same digital revolution that threatened secrecy also enhanced it. Complex encryption, rapid communication. Headset technology that beams plays directly into a quarterback's helmet. All of these innovations gave teams more control. But the paradox is clear. The more you rely on technology, the more you risk losing everything to it. I once read a line from a cybersecurity expert who worked with an NFL franchise. The scariest opponent is not the one on the field. It's the anonymous hacker who wants to leak your playbook just to prove he can. That stayed with me because it underscored how fragile the game's mythology has become. The great chessboard of football, once protected by secrecy, is now vulnerable to forces far outside the stadium walls. And yet, the hunger for secrets hasn't diminished, it's intensified. Fans crave access. Media demands transparency. Players post behind-the-scenes glimpses on social media, sometimes unintentionally revealing more than they should. The league, always balancing entertainment with integrity, feeds this appetite with mixed-up segments, locker room clips, and documentary specials. But behind that curated openness lies a reality that remains constant. Teams still hold things back. They always will. Because football, at its core, thrives on deception. The fake handoff. The disguised coverage. The play-action pass designed to make you bite. Technology can strip away layers, but it cannot erase the DNA of the sport. The question is no longer whether secrets exist, as whether they can survive in a world where secrets are harder than ever to keep. I find myself asking, did technology ruin the mystique, or did it evolve it? Maybe both. The leather-bound playbook has become a relic, but the digital vault carries its own mythology. Hackers instead of spies. Firewalls instead of locked cabinets. Surveillance not from the rival coach's binoculars, but from millions of fans dissecting every pixel. And maybe that's the lesson. The age of secrecy isn't over, it's simply transformed. The NFL no longer exists in the shadows of manila folders and whispered signals. It exists in the endless loop of digital code, where the line between transparency and secrecy is razor thin. Every team, every coach, every player walks that line daily. And in that fragile balance, the game continues to evolve. Because football has always been about control. Control of space. Control of time. Control of knowledge. And in the digital era, control itself has become the most valuable secret of all. In the end, the story of the NFL's secret playbooks is not just about the pages of ink and diagrams that lived inside locked cabinets or guarded binders. It is about the constant arms race between creation and destruction. Between those who sought to conceal knowledge and those who devoted themselves to unmasking it. The final arms race of secrecy in the league is less a single event than a culmination of decades of cultural obsession, tactical ingenuity, paranoia, and the unshakable truth that football is both science and theater, battle of wills as much as a game of yards. By the late 1990s and into the new millennium, the NFL had grown too big, too commercial, and too technologically advanced for secrecy to exist in its old form. Coaches once scribbled complex motions on paper, then whispered about their true meaning to players in hushed film sessions. Now, computer databases, encrypted communications, and even artificial intelligence have changed the way teams build and guard their intellectual property. But the hunger for secrecy has not disappeared, has merely shifted into new battlefields. Teams still search for an edge no opponent can anticipate, and rivals still dedicate endless hours trying to decode the mysteries. It is a cycle that defines professional football. The more closely guarded the knowledge, the more coveted it becomes. Consider the final crescendo of this cultural pattern. As playbooks became digital, so did the paranoia. Security teams were hired not only to protect physical facilities, but also to safeguard servers, tablets, and cloud-stored game plans. When the New England Patriots faced repeated accusations of espionage during the early 2000s, it reflected more than one team's methods. It revealed the depth of distrust across the entire league. Coaches began to believe not only that opponents were watching their sidelines or stealing signals, but also that technology itself could be weaponized. What once required binoculars from the upper deck could now be accomplished with hidden cameras, intercepted headsets, or leaked digital files. The NFL's internal arms race had entered a new, more shadowy phase. Yet secrecy was not simply about avoiding exposure. It was about survival. The league had grown into a multi-billion-dollar empire, where one playoff loss could cost jobs, reputations, and millions of dollars in revenue. Under such pressure, secrecy became synonymous with power. Teams that could mask their tendencies, disguise their intentions, and innovate in silence often controlled the narrative of entire seasons. Think of Bill Belichick's Patriots, who became famous for situational football decisions that looked ordinary on paper, but came alive in the heat of the moment because they were prepared in advance, rehearsed in ways that never reached the public. The brilliance was not just in execution. It was in the secrecy surrounding how those plays were prepared. But this era also revealed the limits of concealment. As much as teams tried to invent the unscoutable, defensive minds evolved just as rapidly. Coordinators like Rex Ryan or Dick LeBeau turned secrecy into their own weapon, hiding blitz packages, disguising coverages, and creating defensive playbooks that were as elaborate as anything on the offensive side. The final arms race, then, was no longer a battle of hiding versus discovering. It was a battle of mutual deception, where both sides understood the other was hiding cards and both prepared countermeasures to anticipate the trick. Every snap of the ball became a test of who had hidden their intentions better. Culturally, this obsession spilled beyond the sidelines. Fans, analysts, and even video game developers began to crave the idea of unlocking the real playbooks. Madden NFL editions tried to approximate authentic team strategies, but the truth was always more elusive. Coaches in real life still held knowledge they would never reveal, adjustments too nuanced to be captured in mass entertainment. This divide created mystique. Part of why the NFL's mythology thrives is because it convinces people there is always more beneath the surface. Every Sunday looks like a showcase of athleticism, but behind it lives the hidden skeleton of plans, playbooks, and unshared secrets. What made the final arms race so fascinating was that it was never truly winnable. The more effort poured into secrecy, the more creative the attempts to break it. Even in the modern NFL, where film access is nearly universal and data analysis is hyper-detailed, teams still believe in keeping certain calls restricted to practice, certain motions saved for only the biggest games. They know that victory often comes down to what is not seen until the exact moment it is needed. The most devastating play is not always the most complex. It is the one that has been hidden in plain sight, waiting until the right time. Players, too, felt the weight of this arms race. Veterans who spent years within one Team-S system carried inside their minds not just the physical playbook, but the philosophy of secrecy itself. When they switched teams, coaches often feared what knowledge might leak. Was it possible to separate loyalty from opportunity? Could a player be trusted to compartmentalize what he knew? These questions fueled countless negotiations, roster decisions, and even suspicions about intent. In a way, every free agent signing was not only about athletic value, but about information transfer, what was being brought in and what might be exposed. As the NFL entered its modern era, secrecy also became entertainment. Sports media began treating rumors of playbook leaks or accusations of stolen signals as headline-worthy drama. Documentaries exposed the cloak-and-dagger elements of the sport, while podcasts debated whether a single hidden play could decide a Super Bowl. Fans became invested in the mythology of secrecy almost as much as the games themselves. It was no longer just about who won on the field. It was about what information had been protected, stolen, or revealed along the way. In the grand arc of football history, the final arms race of secrecy reveals something fundamental. The NFL is not just competition. It is a constant dialogue between what can be known and what must remain hidden. Every coach who ever scribbled a trick play, every scout who ever spied an opponent's formation, every defensive coordinator who disguised coverage to bait a quarterback, they were all contributors to this unending cycle. What drives the NFL forward is not the elimination of secrecy, but the perpetual reinvention of it. And so, the story closes not with a resolution, but with recognition. Secrecy in the NFL is eternal because the game itself demands it. The beauty of football lies not just in athletic collisions or scoreboard victories, but in the mystery of preparation. The fans see the play. The coaches see the plan. But only those within the locker room ever fully grasp the hidden architecture that made it possible. That layered truth is why the league thrives. It is why dynasties are revered, why underdogs are celebrated, and why every season feels like a new chess match played on a 100-yard board. The final arms race of secrecy is, in truth, never final. It continues every week, every practice, every huddle, as long as football is played. What we have traced across history is only the visible outline of a larger story, one where secrecy is not the enemy of the game, but its lifeblood. The NFL has always been a spectacle, but beneath the helmets, behind the closed doors, and hidden inside the playbooks that may never be fully revealed, lies the real game, the eternal battle over what must never be shared. And that is where the legacy of the NFL's secret playbooks will always endure. When we first began this journey through the hidden world of NFL playbooks, it may have seemed like a tale of X's and O's, diagrams on paper, and the chess match of offense versus defense. But as we've uncovered, it was always more than that. These secret playbooks were not just about tricking an opponent on Sunday. They represented culture, identity, innovation, paranoia, and even power itself. To talk about hidden playbooks is to talk about the very DNA of the NFL, a game that thrives on spectacle, thrives on strategy, and thrives on the thin line between what is revealed and what is concealed. the NFL has always been a league of contradictions. It demands transparency from its players, its teams, and its coaches' film is dissected. Stats are broadcast, and every Sunday, millions of fans are granted what looks like total access. Yet at the same time, the league has cultivated a shadow world where secrecy is the most valuable currency. Coaches locked their offices, shredded practice notes, and ordered interns to burn scouting reports in trash cans out back. Team staffers checked hotel hallways to make sure no spies were lurking. Broadcasters called it gamesmanship. But for those inside the building, it was survival. The hidden playbook became the symbolic weapon. It was not merely a collection of plays, but a coded manual of deception. Inside those pages were things fans never saw. Double motion formations designed to confuse defenders. Trap plays that looked like one thing and delivered another. Signals disguised as hand scratches or hat tilts. Some coaches even went as far as embedding fake signals just to bait opponents into false reads. What fans saw as an incomplete pass might have been the result of weeks of layers upon layers of tactical bluffing. But the culture of secrecy was not only about what happened between the lines. It extended into the very heart of rivalries and legacies. Take the case of Bill Walsh and his West Coast offense. To outsiders, it looked like a series of short passes, precise timing, and rhythm. But the playbook contained dozens of tiny variations, branching routes, option reads, and situational wrinkles that were never publicly explained. Walsh didn't just draw plays, he built a coded language only his players understood, a language that even seasoned opponents struggled to crack. His success was not merely in the execution, but in the maintenance of secrecy. Every week, new wrinkles were unveiled, while older plays were disguised with fresh motion. On the defensive side, Buddy Ryan's 46 defense looked like organized chaos. To the untrained eye, it was just a pile of bodies at the line of scrimmage. But Ryan's hidden playbook held the true scheme, precisely where each linebacker shifted, exactly how safeties disguised their coverage, and the deceptive way in which blitzers disguised intent. Offensive lines would spend all week preparing, only to be ambushed by a wrinkle they'd never seen. Ryan knew the true value of secrecy wasn't in overwhelming force, but in the opponent's doubt. If they weren't sure where the blitz was coming from, it was already too late. Yet the arms race of secrecy came with consequences. By the 2000s, the league was embroiled in controversies like Spygate, when the Patriots were accused of filming opponents' signals. What shocked fans most wasn't the act itself fit, was the realization that this was only the surface. Suddenly, the public glimpsed what insiders had known all along. The NFL was built on an undercurrent of surveillance, trickery, and hidden codes. What had once been seen as folklore now became front-page scandal. It was the moment when secrecy, long accepted as part of the game, crossed into something darker in the public eye. And yet, even as technology advanced and the NFL tightened its rules, secrecy didn't die adapted. Coaches shifted from signal boards to wristbands, from sideline hand signals to helmet radios. Instead of eliminating the arms race, it simply changed the battlefield. Information security became as critical as nutrition, film study, or weight training. Analysts today often compare NFL coaching staffs to intelligence agencies. Every practice field is a secure facility. Every iPad is encrypted. Every playbook carries digital protections to prevent leaks. In some ways, the game has never been more open. Fans can watch all 22 film online. Data analytics are publicly available, but in others, the playbook has never been more sealed. What does this all mean? On one level, it shows us the relentless competitiveness of the league. Secrecy is not a side effect of football. It is the engine that drives it forward. On another level, it shows us something about human nature. The hidden playbook appeals to the same instincts that fuel espionage thrillers, coded messages, and the idea of possessing knowledge others do not. For players, holding the secret playbook made them feel part of something greater than themselves. For coaches, guarding it was proof of mastery. For fans, even without knowing its contents, the myth of the secret playbook became part of the game's aura. The legacy of these hidden playbooks is not just tactically, it's cultural. They fueled rivalries like Cowboys versus 49ers, where each sideline believed the other held some hidden edge. They defined dynasties, from Lombardi's Packers to Belichick's Patriots, each team cloaking its brilliance behind walls of secrecy. They also shaped how we think of football itself. When we say the game is chess, not checkers, what we really mean is that somewhere, deep in a binder or a tablet, lies a move no one else has seen yet. And this raises the ultimate paradox. The NFL is entertainment designed for spectacle. Yet at its core, it is driven by secrecy, by things never shown to the public. That paradox is perhaps why the game endures. Every Sunday, fans see the product, but they also sense the invisible the ghost plays, the hidden tactics, the possibilities that never made it onto the field but shaped what they saw. The secret playbook becomes myth because it is both real and unknowable. It exists, and yet, to most, it is forever hidden. As we close this journey, one truth stands out above all. Secrecy is not just a layer of football, it is football. The hidden playbooks, whether written on paper, coded into tablets, or locked in the minds of coaches, are not mere side notes to history. They are the hidden spine of the sport, the invisible current beneath every touchdown, interception, and championship banner. In the end, the NFL's secret playbooks are a reminder that greatness is never just about strength, speed, or even skill. It is about imagination, about foresight, and about the discipline to keep the most powerful weapons hidden until the exact moment they must be revealed. And maybe that is why we keep watching, because deep down, we know that behind every play we see, there lies another story, one we were never meant to know.